Blow out your sister's candles and stop embarrassing us." My mother hissed the words with venom as my father casually tossed my untouched birthday cake straight into the garbage. I turned 18 that night. I packed my birth certificate, grabbed the hidden bank statements I was never meant to find, and walked out the front door without a single goodbye. Then the inheritance fraud was exposed. But before I tell you exactly how their perfect suburban facade collapsed, let me take you back to the kitchen where my childhood officially ended. I stood frozen by the cold granite kitchen island. The sounds of loud laughter, pop music, and the clinking of expensive crystal glasses drifted in from the living room. It was a dual birthday celebration, at least on paper. My sister Brittany was turning 20 and I was turning 18. But the reality playing out in our Portland, Oregon home was entirely different. My father, Richard, stood over the stainless steel trash can. In his hands was a small plastic-encased sheet cake from the local discount grocery store. The neon pink frosting was already smudged against the clear plastic lid. It had no name written on it. No happy birthday, Abigail. It was just a leftover clearance item he had picked up on his way home from work, because he forgot what day it was until my aunt called that morning. He did not even bother to open it. He simply dropped the entire plastic container into the trash, right on top of discarded food scraps, coffee grounds, and crumpled cocktail napkins. I stared at the pink frosting smeared against the side of the garbage bag. I asked him what he was doing. My voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. He did not look at me. He just wiped his hands on a linen dish towel and sighed with heavy theatrical annoyance. He told me we needed the counter space. "Brittany's custom cake is arriving any minute," he said, speaking to me as if I were a slow-witted employee who had failed to comprehend a basic instruction. "It is a 4-tier fondant masterpiece, Abigail. We cannot have your little grocery store cake cluttering up the presentation area. The caterers need room to work and plate the desserts." My little grocery store cake. The one nobody had sung over. The one nobody had bothered to put a single candle in. For 18 years, my milestones were nothing but invisible footnotes to Brittany's grand celebrated life. When I graduated middle school with highest honors and straight A's, they skipped the ceremony entirely to take Brittany touring expensive private liberal arts colleges. When I saved up from my after-school job to buy my own winter coat because they refused to replace my torn one, my father called me an ungrateful brat for making them look like bad providers in front of the neighbors. Right on cue, the heavy swinging kitchen doors pushed open. 2 caterers in crisp white shirts wheeled in a massive silver serving cart. Sitting on top of it was a stunning 4-tier vanilla bean cake decorated with edible gold leaf sponge sugar pearls and fresh cascading sugar roses. The invoice taped to the side of the silver cart read $850. My discarded cake, currently sitting in the trash, cost exactly $7.99. That was the exact numerical value my parents placed on my existence. My mother, Susan, swept into the kitchen right behind the caterers. She wore a tailored sapphire blue cocktail dress that probably cost a full month of my minimum wage diner tips. She barely glanced at the magnificent gold leaf cake before turning her sharp, hypercritical eyes on me. "Abigail, what on earth are you doing just standing there like a statue?" She snapped her manicured fingers at me to get my attention. "Brittany's friends are running out of champagne and the hors d'oeuvres are getting low. Take the heavy silver tray from the counter and start doing the rounds in the living room. And smooth out your hair, you look like an absolute mess." I looked down at my faded black cotton dress. It was the exact same dress I wore to my evening shifts at the local diner where I waitressed 4 days a week. I'd asked them for a new dress for my 18th birthday. Just one nice, simple outfit to celebrate officially becoming an adult and graduating high school. My mother had laughed in my face and told me they were completely tapped out from paying for Brittany's exclusive country club membership and her new semester tuition at her private university. "We are making serious financial sacrifices to keep this family afloat, Abigail," she had told me just yesterday. "You need to learn to be a team player and stop acting like everything in this house revolves around your petty wants." I looked from my mother in her sparkling sapphire dress to my father casually adjusting his expensive gold watch, and then over to the trash can where my birthday cake sat rotting among the garbage. Something deep inside my chest irrevocably shifted. It felt like a heavy iron chain snapping. For years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had played the role of the silent, burdensome youngest child. I had accepted their narrative that Brittany was the golden investment, the one destined for a wealthy husband and a prominent social life. While I was simply an unfortunate expense, they begrudged every single day of my life. I asked my mother why Brittany's friends could not walk 10 feet to the bar to get their own drinks. I reminded her, keeping my voice perfectly level, that it was my 18th birthday too. Susan let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the granite countertops. She stepped much closer to me, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper, so the caterers arranging plates nearby would not overhear her. "Do not start this dramatic attention-seeking nonsense tonight, Abigail. Your sister is out there networking with some very important people from Bradley Sterling's family. Bradley comes from real money. His family practically owns half the commercial real estate in this city. Brittany needs to make a flawless impression, and I will not let your petty jealousy ruin her moment." I asked her what Brittany's networking had to do with me acting as an unpaid servant at my own supposed birthday party. My father stepped up beside my mother, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He looked down at me with utter, undisguised disdain. "It has everything to do with you finally pulling your weight in this house. We feed you. We put a roof over your head. You have been a relentless financial drain on this family for 18 years. The absolute least you can do is pass out some drinks and help your sister secure her future. Stop being so incredibly selfish and get to work." A financial drain. The words echoed loudly in the spotless gourmet kitchen. I worked 20 hours a week just to buy my own school supplies, my own shoes, and my own personal items, because they absolutely refused to give me a single dime of allowance. I did all the household laundry. I scrubbed the hardwood floors. I managed the daily household chores while Brittany slept in until noon every single weekend. Yet in their eyes, I was the heavy burden dragging them down. I turned my head and looked at the digital green clock glowing on the microwave display. It read 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight. 15 minutes until I was legally an adult in the eyes of the law. 15 minutes until they had absolutely zero legal authority over me anymore. I am not serving drinks to anyone. I said the words clearly, pronouncing every syllable with cold precision. I am not a caterer, I am not your maid, and I am certainly not Brittany's servant. My mother grabbed my upper arm, her sharp manicured nails digging painfully into my skin through the thin cotton of my dress. She yanked me toward her. "Blow out your sister's candles and stop embarrassing us right now." She hissed the words, her face twisting with rage. "If you ruin this important night for Brittany, I swear to you, I will make you regret it for the rest of your miserable life." I pulled my arm out of her aggressive grip with a violent, sudden jerk. "You do not have to worry about me ruining anything ever again," I told her, my voice eerily calm. "I am completely done." My father took a heavy, threatening step forward, his face turning an angry, mottled shade of red. "You walk out of this kitchen right now and you can pack your bags, Abigail. I am sick and tired of housing a disrespectful, ungrateful burden. If you cannot support this family's goals, you do not belong in this house. Get out of my sight." He thought the threat of sudden homelessness would terrify me into submission. He genuinely thought I would break down, cry, apologize profusely, and meekly pick up the heavy silver serving tray. He had used that exact same threat to control and silence me since I was 14 years old. But tonight was entirely different. Tonight, the familiar panic was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow, hyper-focused clarity. I looked him dead in the eye, unflinching, and simply said, "Okay." I turned my back on both of them and walked out of the kitchen. I ignored my mother shouting my name in a panicked, angry whisper. I ignored the loud bass of the pop music and the clinking crystal glasses as I walked straight through the crowded living room. Brittany was standing by the stone fireplace, laughing loudly, with a group of wealthy-looking 20-somethings, holding a glass of expensive champagne. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her younger sister was walking out of her life forever. I took the carpeted stairs 2 at a time, moving silently. I went straight to my small, sparsely furnished bedroom and pulled a faded canvas duffel bag from under my narrow bed. I packed efficiently and ruthlessly 7 pairs of underwear, 5 plain shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, my diner waitressing uniform, my toothbrush, a single photograph of my late grandfather. Everything I truly owned in the world fit effortlessly into that one bag. But before I could leave the house, I needed my vital documents. My official birth certificate and my social security card were locked inside my father's heavy steel safe in his ground floor home office. He kept all the important family paperwork and financial records locked away there. I knew the combination perfectly because I was the one who was forced to fetch his tax files every April when he was too lazy to organize them himself. I slipped quietly back down the hall and opened the door to his office. The room was pitch dark, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the street lamp, filtering through the closed horizontal blinds. I knelt on the plush carpet, spun the cool metal dial on the heavy door, and heard the satisfying heavy click of the internal mechanism. I pulled the handle down and swung the safe open. I reached directly into the top shelf compartment where the birth certificates were kept in thick labeled manila envelopes. As my fingers brushed against the envelope marked with my name, I accidentally knocked over a separate unmarked dark blue folder sitting precariously beside it. The heavy folder hit the floor with a soft thud, and a thick stack of bank statements and legal documents spilled out onto the carpet. I knelt down to gather the scattered papers quickly, intending to shove them back into the safe and run. But as I picked up the very first page, my own name caught my eye printed in bold black ink at the top of the header. Abigail Rose Preston. I froze completely. I moved closer to the window, holding the paper up to the amber streetlight to read the document clearly. It was an official bank statement for a high-yield inheritance trust account. The primary sole beneficiary listed was me. The grantor of the trust was my late grandfather, Thomas Preston, who had passed away when I was 10 years old. My hands began to shake violently as I flipped through the heavy stack of pages. The legal trust had been established with a massive principal amount of $200,000. The attached legal instructions were crystal clear and legally binding. The funds were strictly to be released to me upon my 18th birthday, for the express purpose of university tuition and establishing my independent adult life. But as my eyes tracked down to the most recent transaction history column, my blood turned to solid ice. The account balance at the bottom of the page read 0. It was completely empty. I frantically shuffled through the previous months of statements. Starting exactly 3 years ago, massive unauthorized withdrawals had been made on a consistent monthly basis. $10,000 here, $25,000 there. The money had been systematically and deliberately siphoned out of my protected trust, and I saw exactly where it had gone. Every single withdrawal was explicitly transferred into a secondary commercial business account, an LLC, registered jointly to Richard and Susan Preston. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They had not just favored my sister emotionally. They had not just treated me like an unwanted burden to save pennies. They had actively, criminally stolen my entire financial future to fund their luxurious suburban lifestyle. Every expensive country club membership fee, every designer dress hanging in Brittany's closet, every lavish family vacation to luxury resorts they took. While leaving me behind, it had all been paid for with my grandfather's money. The money he left specifically to protect me. I stood there in the dark, silent office, holding the undeniable documented proof of their massive financial betrayal. The digital clock on my father's mahogany desk quietly ticked over to midnight. I was 18 years old. I was officially an adult under the law, and I had just discovered that I had been robbed blind by the very people who were supposed to protect and provide for me. I did not scream out in anger. I did not run back to the living room and confront them in front of their wealthy guests. Confrontation right now would be a strategic mistake. It would give them the immediate chance to lie, to manipulate the narrative, or worse, to physically snatch the incriminating documents right out of my hands. Instead, I carefully folded the bank statements, the transfer ledgers, and the original trust documents. I zipped them securely into the hidden interior pocket of my duffel bag. I grabbed my birth certificate and my social security card, tucking them away safely. I closed the heavy safe door, spinning the dial rapidly to lock it tight. I walked quietly down the back utility staircase, avoiding the main living area entirely. I slipped out the heavy oak back door and stepped onto the cold concrete of the driveway. The night air was sharp and biting against my face. I had exactly $42 in my checking account and a single bag of clothes slung over my shoulder. I had no car, no destination, and no immediate safety net. But as I walked away from the house filled with fake laughter and stolen money, I made a silent, unbreakable promise to the quiet, dark street. I was going to survive this. I was going to learn exactly how money moved in the real world. And one day, when they least expected it, I was going to systematically take back every single thing they stole from me. The Portland air was unforgiving that night. I walked block after block with nothing but a canvas duffel bag cutting into my shoulder and $42 to my name. Every passing car made my heart hammer against my ribs. I expected my father to pull up beside me, to drag me back to that kitchen, to force me to apologize for ruining Brittany's perfect birthday. But the streets remained empty. They had not come after me. They simply did not care. I walked until my feet blistered in my cheap canvas shoes, finally seeking refuge in a brightly lit 24-hour diner on the edge of the city limits. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a harsh red glow on the wet pavement. I walked inside, ordered the cheapest cup of black coffee on the menu, and sat in the back booth. I stayed there until the sun came up, pretending to read a menu while keeping my duffel bag clutched tightly between my knees. The next 3 days were a blur of absolute terror and desperate survival. I found a rundown motel that accepted cash, paying $35 for a room that smelled like stale smoke and damp carpet. I locked the flimsy door and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, pulling out the stolen bank statements. I read them over and over until the numbers burned into my memory. $200,000. My future drained to fund their country club lifestyle. When my money ran out on the 4th day, I walked back to that same neon-lit diner. I asked the manager, a gruff man named Henry, who looked like he had not slept in a decade, for a job. I told him I would work any shift, do any task, and I could start immediately. He handed me a stained apron and pointed to a section of dirty tables. For the next 2 weeks, I lived on a diet of leftover fries and stale coffee. I worked double shifts, taking the graveyard hours because they paid a slight premium and kept me off the dark streets. My body ached in ways I did not know were possible. My hands were cracked from cheap dish soap and my feet throbbed constantly. I pooled my tips to rent a small windowless room above a hardware store, miles away from the affluent suburban neighborhood where my family lived. I was exhausted, terrified, and completely alone. But for the very first time in my entire life, I was free. Nobody was calling me a burden. Nobody was demanding I serve them. I was surviving on my own terms. But freedom, I quickly learned, is rarely won without a fight. My parents had noticed the missing documents. They had opened that heavy steel safe, realized the grandfather's trust files were gone, and connected the dots. They did not launch a desperate search for their missing 18-year-old daughter to ensure she was safe. They launched a desperate search for the evidence that could put them in federal prison. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. The diner was packed with the usual dinner rush. The air was thick with the smell of fried onions and brewing coffee. I was balancing 3 heavy porcelain plates on my arm, rushing toward a corner booth, when the bell above the front door chimed loudly. I glanced up out of habit. My breath caught in my throat, and the plates in my hands suddenly felt as heavy as lead. My father, Richard, stood in the entryway. He wore his tailored gray business suit, looking completely out of place among the tired truck drivers and factory workers eating at the counter. His eyes scanned the crowded room with predatory precision, and then they locked onto me. He did not look worried. He did not look like a father relieved to find his missing child safe and alive. His face was a mask of cold, calculating fury. He walked straight toward me, his heavy leather shoes thudding against the checkered linoleum floor. I quickly set the plates down at the nearest table, ignoring the confused customer, and took a step back. Richard did not stop until he was standing uncomfortably close to me, invading my personal space, towering over my small frame. The sheer physical presence of him brought back a tidal wave of childhood panic. My hands began to shake, and I quickly wiped them on my stained apron to hide my fear. "You have something that belongs to me, Abigail," he said. His voice was completely devoid of any parental warmth. It was low, dangerous, and dripping with venom. I looked him directly in the eye, refusing to back away. "I do not have anything that belongs to you," I replied, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "I only have what belongs to me." His jaw tightened, a visible muscle ticking in his cheek. "Do not play stupid games with me," he hissed, taking another step forward and forcing me back against the edge of a booth. "You opened my private safe. You stole confidential family financial records. That is grand larceny, Abigail. You are going to walk to the back room, get your bag, and hand those files over to me right this second. If you do not, I will pull out my phone, call the police, and have you arrested for theft. You will spend your 18th birthday year in a jail cell. The threat hit me hard. A few weeks ago, that exact threat would have made me collapse in tears. I would have handed over the documents, begged for his forgiveness, and accepted whatever punishment he deemed appropriate. I had been conditioned my entire life to fear his anger, to believe that he held absolute authority over my fate. But standing there in the diner surrounded by strangers, feeling the exhaustion in my bones and the cheap fabric of my uniform against my skin, something shifted. The fear evaporated, replaced by a sudden razor-sharp clarity. If I was simply an ungrateful runaway who stole meaningless papers, he would have called the police days ago. He would have sent officers to drag me home. But he did not call the police. He came here himself in secret, trying to intimidate me into handing the documents back quietly. He was terrified of anyone else seeing those bank statements. He was terrified of the law. Call them, I said clearly. The words hung in the air between us. Richard blinked, clearly thrown off balance by my response. What did you just say? I said, call the police. I raised my voice just enough so the customers sitting in the booths nearby could hear the tension. Let us get law enforcement down here right now. We can show them the trust documents. We can show the police exactly how $200,000 of my inheritance was magically transferred into a private commercial business account registered to you and Susan. I am sure the fraud division would be incredibly interested to see how you funded Brittany's luxury car and your country club membership with a trust that was legally protected in my name. His face drained of color, transitioning rapidly from an angry red to a sickly pale white. He looked around the diner nervously, suddenly hyper-aware of the audience. Several customers had stopped eating. The low murmur of conversation had died down. A burly truck driver in the next booth had turned completely around in his seat, watching my father with open hostility. My manager, Henry, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. Keep your voice down, Richard whispered frantically, his previously commanding tone fracturing into panic. You do not understand what you are looking at. You are a child. You do not understand how complex family finances work. The money was moved for tax purposes to protect your future. We were keeping it safe for you, protecting my future by draining the account to zero, keeping it safe by letting me wear torn coats while my sister drove a new car. The absolute audacity of his lies was almost breathtaking. He was still trying to gaslight me, still treating me like the gullible scapegoat who would accept any excuse to avoid conflict. Do not ever lie to me again, I said, my voice hardening into something cold and unrecognizable to both of us. The account is empty. I saw the transfer ledgers. I saw the business entity name. I know exactly what you and Mom did. He stepped closer, his demeanor shifting from aggressive to desperately manipulative. He tried to reach out and grab my arm the exact same way my mother had done in the kitchen on my birthday. Abigail, please listen to reason. If those documents get out, if you cause a scandal, it will destroy this family. It will ruin your sister's future. Do you really want to destroy your own family over a misunderstanding? I pulled my arm away violently. You are not my family, I told him, making sure my voice carried across the room. You are just the people who stole from me. Now get out of my workplace before I ask my manager to throw you out. Henry, seeing the aggressive movement, walked up behind me. He crossed his thick arms over his chest and glared at my father. Is there a problem here? Abigail, Henry asked, his deep voice rumbling with quiet authority. Is this man bothering you? Richard looked at Henry, then at the watchful truck driver, and finally back at me. He realized he had lost the upper hand. He could not bully me in a room full of working-class strangers who clearly had my back. He straightened his expensive tie, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. He leaned in close one last time, his voice dropping to a toxic, hateful whisper. You think you are so smart, he said bitterly. You are nothing but a naive little girl playing a game you cannot possibly win. You have no money. You have no education. You have absolutely no power. You will come crawling back to us when you realize how cruel the real world is. And when you do, we will not open the door. Keep the damn papers. They will not do you any good anyway. You do not even know what they mean." He turned on his heel and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming cheerfully as the door slammed shut behind him. I watched his expensive luxury sedan pull out of the parking lot and merge into the heavy evening traffic. My hands were shaking so violently I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow, leaving me dizzy and gasping for breath. Henry put a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder and told me to take a break in the back room. I sat on an overturned milk crate in the quiet storage room, breathing in the scent of flour and old grease, staring at my trembling hands. My father had meant those final words to break my spirit. He wanted me to feel small, helpless, and uneducated. He wanted me to believe that without their wealth and their status, I was destined to fail. But instead of breaking me, his arrogant parting insult sparked a fire in my chest that would burn for the next 10 years. He was right about one thing. I did not fully understand the complex legal and financial implications of the documents hidden in my duffel bag. I knew they had stolen from me, but I did not know the specific legal mechanisms they had used. I did not know how corporate LLC structures functioned, or how trust fund disbursements were regulated under state law. I was just an 18-year-old waitress with a high school diploma and a few dollars in tips. If I tried to fight them right now with their expensive lawyers and their country club connections, they would absolutely crush me. They would tie me up in legal red tape, bury me in injunctions, and likely find a way to make me look like a delusional runaway. I needed power. I needed undeniable, absolute expertise. I needed to understand exactly how the financial world operated, so I could systematically dismantle the fraudulent empire they had built with my grandfather's money. That very night, after my shift ended at 2 a.m, I walked to a 24-hour internet cafe downtown. I paid $4 for an hour of computer access. I did not look up cheap apartments or waitressing jobs. I pulled up the website for the local community college. I looked at their business and accounting degree programs. I researched the exact educational requirements to become a certified public accountant. I calculated the tuition costs, the credit hours, and the night class schedules. I realized it was not going to be a quick revenge. It was going to require years of grueling, exhausting work. I would have to serve thousands of tables, study late into the night, and sacrifice every normal aspect of my youth. But as I sat in that dark internet cafe staring at the bright screen, I made a vow to the grandfather who had tried to protect me. I was not going to be the victim of their story. I was going to be the architect of their downfall. The next morning, I walked into the admissions office and enrolled in my first 3 night classes: Introduction to Financial Accounting, Business Law, Macroeconomics. I paid the enrollment fees in wrinkled tip money. I bought used textbooks from upperclassmen. I arranged my diner shifts so I could work from dawn until the late afternoon, go to class in the evening, and study until my eyes physically could not stay open. My parents thought they had seen the last of me. They thought I would fade into obscurity, a forgotten, uneducated girl struggling to pay rent in a bad neighborhood, while they continued to live a life of stolen luxury. They thought the secret of the drained inheritance trust was safely buried forever, because the only person who knew about it was too weak to do anything. They were completely, disastrously wrong. They had not buried a secret. They had planted a seed. And over the next decade, while they continued to fund Britney's lavish life and boast about their fake success, I was quietly, ruthlessly building an arsenal. The 10-year plan had officially begun, and I would not stop until I understood every single number on those bank statements. I would not stop until I was ready to strike. 10 years is a long time to build an impenetrable fortress. At 28 years old, I sat behind a massive oak desk in a corner office on the 22nd floor of a gleaming high-rise in downtown Seattle. I was no longer the terrified, exhausted 18-year-old girl who had fled a Portland kitchen with exactly $42 and a stolen birthday cake sitting in the trash. I was Abigail Rose Preston, senior forensic accountant at a highly respected mid-sized financial firm. I spent my days hunting down hidden assets, unraveling complex corporate embezzlement schemes, and exposing the invisible threads of stolen money that arrogant criminals thought they had buried perfectly. I was extremely good at my job. I had to be. My entire survival had depended on learning exactly how financial deception worked in the real world. Getting to this corner office had been an agonizing uphill battle. While my peers in college were attending football games and taking weekend trips, I was working back-to-back graveyard shifts at the diner. I studied tax law until my vision blurred. I lived in cramped, unheated apartments, saving every single dollar to pay for my accounting certifications. I built a completely independent life entirely out of my own sheer willpower, but the ghost of my past never completely stopped haunting me. Over the past decade, my biological parents had tried repeatedly to drag me back into their chaotic, fraudulent financial web. They never called to ask if I was healthy, if I was safe, or if I had enough to eat. They only called when they needed a compliant victim to co-sign a loan. When I was 22 and barely finishing my accounting degree, my mother, Susan, had somehow managed to track down my new cell phone number. She called me weeping hysterically, begging me to co-sign a massive auto loan for my sister, Brittany. Brittany had completely ruined her own credit score maxing out credit cards on designer handbags. I refused and hung up. When I was 25, my father Richard sent a series of aggressively demanding emails. He insisted I put my name on a high-interest business line of credit to help them expand their so-called real estate portfolio. I blocked his email address instantly. Every single time they reached out, it was a blatant manipulative attempt to use my clean, hard-earned credit history to fund their endless suburban facade. I built ironclad boundaries. I locked my credit file with all 3 major bureaus. I changed my phone number multiple times. I absolutely refused to let them drag me down into the suffocating debt they were so clearly drowning in. Then, about 3 weeks ago, their predictable pattern of aggressive demands abruptly changed. The angry emails and demanding letters completely stopped. Instead, Susan began leaving frantic, overly sweet voicemails directly on my secure office phone line. I still do not know how she managed to bypass the receptionist and get the direct extension to my desk in Seattle, but hearing her voice echoing through my office speaker sent a cold, warning shiver down my spine. "Abigail, sweetheart," she cooed in one message, her tone dripping with thick, fake maternal affection. "It has been so incredibly long since we heard your voice. Your father and I miss you terribly. We just want to reconnect and see our youngest daughter. Please call your mother back." 2 days later, another heavily scripted message arrived. "Abigail, darling, Brittany is doing so well right now, and we really want to put all the silly past misunderstandings behind us. Family is the most important thing in the world, Abigail. We have a wonderful, exciting surprise for you. Please just pick up the phone so we can plan a visit." It was completely unnatural and deeply unsettling. Susan Preston never apologized. Susan Preston never sought reconciliation unless it served a specific, highly selfish purpose. She was incapable of genuine affection. The sugary sweetness in her voice was not an olive branch. It was a carefully disguised trap. I ignored every single call. I knew better than to engage with a predator who was suddenly pretending to be a loving mother. I instructed my firm's front desk to block all incoming calls from the Portland area code. I thought my silence would force them to give up and move on to an easier target, but my silence did not deter them. It only forced them to play their actual desperate hand. The real attack did not come through a manipulative voicemail. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning via certified signature-required mail. I was reviewing a massive corporate audit file when the firm's senior receptionist walked into my office and handed me a thick, official-looking envelope. She looked concerned. The return address printed in stark black letters belonged to the Internal Revenue Service. My heart skipped a beat, hammering hard against my ribs. As a certified public accountant, any direct correspondence from the Federal Tax Authority is treated with absolute immediate panic. Our entire professional career, our state license to practice, and our ability to earn a living rests entirely on maintaining absolute financial compliance and unquestionable integrity. I reached for my brass letter opener and sliced the envelope open. My hands were remarkably steady, but my stomach dropped as I unfolded the formal legal notice. As I read through the dense bureaucratic paragraphs, the blood drained completely from my face. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the edges of my mahogany desk. Richard and Susan Preston had filed a convoluted, highly fraudulent amended tax return. They had explicitly illegally claimed me as a financial dependent for the past 3 consecutive tax years. They had utilized an obscure, outdated tax loophole claiming to the federal government that they had been providing more than half of my financial support due to a fabricated severe medical disability that prevented me from working. They had forged my signature on a series of supporting legal documents to claim massive backdated tax credits, dependent deductions, and medical expense write-offs. They had done all of this to artificially offset their own catastrophic tax liabilities. They were clearly drowning in debt, owing massive sums to the government, and they had maliciously decided to use my stolen identity as a human shield to save themselves from a devastating federal tax audit. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their crime was staggering. But it was not just a desperate, pathetic money grab. It was a direct, lethal threat to my entire professional existence. By falsely claiming me as a disabled dependent and forging my signature on federal tax documents, they had legally compromised my pristine financial standing. The letter in my hand was an official notice of discrepancy. The IRS had flagged my own legitimate high-income tax returns because they directly conflicted with the fraudulent dependent claims my parents had submitted. If the IRS initiated a full formal investigation into this massive discrepancy, my CPA license would be immediately flagged and potentially suspended pending the outcome of a federal fraud inquiry. My firm, which required absolute ethical standing from its senior accountants, would be legally forced to terminate my employment immediately. Everything I had built over 10 grueling years, every late-night study session, every double shift at the diner, every sacrifice I had made to escape their toxic grip was about to be completely wiped out because my parents needed a fraudulent tax break to keep funding their fake country club lifestyle. They were perfectly willing to destroy my entire life just to save themselves a few $1,000s. I sat in my quiet, soundproof office overlooking the gray Seattle skyline, and a deep, righteous fury ignited in the very center of my chest. It burned hotter than any anger I had ever felt. The terrified, helpless teenager who had run away in the dark was entirely gone. I was a professional, highly trained forensic accountant, and they had just made the catastrophic mistake of dragging me into a financial fight. They had just handed me the absolute legal justification for their own destruction. Ignoring them was no longer a viable option. Running away and hiding was no longer an option. I had to formally, brutally, and systematically audit my own family's history to protect my license and my hard-earned freedom. I had to prove their fraud to the federal government, and to do that, I needed to expose everything. I stood up, packed my briefcase, and told my managing partner I was taking a few days of personal leave to handle an urgent family legal matter. I left the office and drove straight to my secure downtown apartment. I bypassed the kitchen and walked directly into my bedroom closet, pulling back the floorboards to reveal my heavy steel fireproof safe. I spun the dial with practiced efficiency, feeling a profound sense of dark irony as the heavy door clicked open. Inside, sitting neatly at the very bottom beneath my passports and emergency cash, was the faded canvas duffel bag I had carried out of Portland 10 years ago. I pulled it out, unzipped the main compartment, and reached deep inside the hidden interior pocket. I pulled out the thick stack of aged bank statements and the original legal trust documents. The papers were slightly yellowed at the edges, now stiff and fragile, but the numbers printed on them were just as damning, just as explosive as they had been on the night of my 18th birthday. $200,000. Stolen systematically from my grandfather's protected inheritance trust. Transferred illegally into a private limited liability company controlled entirely by Richard and Susan Preston. 10 years ago, I did not understand how corporate structures worked. I did not know how to follow the money through shell companies and hidden accounts. I was just a kid staring at numbers that made no sense. But today, tracing hidden funds and exposing corporate fraud was literally my profession. I cleared my large dining room table and laid the 10-year-old documents out in chronological order. I opened my secure encrypted work laptop and logged into my professional investigative databases. I was going to track every single penny they had stolen from me. I was going to find out exactly where that limited liability company was hiding its assets today. I started cross-referencing the old commercial account numbers with modern public business registries in the state of Oregon. I pulled up historical property tax records in Multnomah County. I traced the names of their known business associates and scoured public legal filings for any mention of their LLC. I worked straight through the night, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating my face in the dark apartment. I was fueled by black coffee and a decade of suppressed icy rage. The deeper I dug into their financial web, the more horrifying and fragile the picture became. They had not just stolen my inheritance. They had used it as the seed money to build an entire house of cards, constantly shifting debt from one credit line to another, constantly faking wealth they did not actually possess. They needed my clean credit and my tax identity right now, because their own financial empire was entirely fake, and the walls were finally closing in on them. I printed out the first batch of damning public records and pinned them to a corkboard I had dragged out of my home office. I drew a thick black line connecting my grandfather's drained trust account directly to the Preston Family, LLC. I stepped back and looked at the board. I was going to tear their perfect suburban facade down brick by brick, and I was going to start by finding out exactly what they were currently spending my stolen money on. I sat at my solid oak dining room table as the heavy Seattle rain battered against the glass of my high-rise apartment windows. I had my yellow highlighters, my thick yellow legal pads, and my secure professional laptop arranged in front of me. I was no longer a terrified, helpless teenager shivering in a diner uniform. I was a highly trained certified forensic accountant. My entire career was built on finding the hidden truth buried inside complex financial lies. I took a deep breath, opened the fragile 10-year-old bank statements I had rescued from my father's safe, and began the meticulous process of formally auditing my own family. The first step was building a comprehensive timeline. I needed to match the exact dates of the massive cash withdrawals from my grandfather's protected trust account to the public records of my parents' lifestyle back in Portland. The picture that rapidly emerged on my computer screen made my stomach churn with a sickening mixture of disgust and absolute fury. Exactly 2 weeks after $50,000 vanished from my legally protected trust, Richard and Susan Preston were suddenly inducted into the Oak Ridge Country Club. This was the most exclusive, fiercely guarded social institution in the county. I found the public announcements buried in the digital archives of the local society pages. They were photographed holding champagne flutes, smiling with the local elite. I pulled up the country club's membership documentation. The mandatory upfront initiation fee matched the stolen $50,000 down to the very last cent. They had literally stolen my college education to buy their way into elite high society. But their vanity did not stop at golf courses and cocktail parties. I turned my attention to their religious life. My parents absolutely loved to portray themselves as pious, generous community leaders at our affluent suburban church. They used their faith as a glittering shield to hide their terrible character. I accessed the church's annual donor recognition newsletters from their public digital archives spanning the last decade. They're listed prominently in the platinum tier of elite financial donors, were Richard and Susan Preston. I cross-referenced the dates of their heavily publicized massive charitable contributions. Every single time they handed a giant, oversized novelty check to the church building fund. A corresponding withdrawal had been illegally siphoned from my grandfather's trust just days prior. They had bought their pristine social reputation, their front-row velvet pews, and the absolute admiration of their entire congregation, using the money my grandfather had explicitly set aside to protect his youngest granddaughter. The most painful discovery, however, was tracking the money spent on my older sister. I spent hours scrolling backward through 10 years of Brittany's public social media posts. Her carefully curated timeline was a sickening continuous display of unearned wealth and arrogant luxury. I saw the photographs of the brand new, fully loaded imported luxury sport utility vehicle she received as a college graduation present. I found the albums documenting her month-long extravagant summer vacations across Europe. I calculated the estimated retail value of the endless parade of designer handbags, shoes, and jewelry she constantly flaunted online. I matched every single major lifestyle purchase to the withdrawal ledger. The dates aligned with terrifying, undeniable precision. While I had been aggressively scrubbing dirty tables at a roadside diner until my hands cracked and bled, my family was living like royalty. While I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep a night and eating instant noodles to afford my accounting textbooks, my sister was sipping expensive wine in Paris on my dime. My parents had actively, maliciously chosen to enforce my complete poverty in order to fund her absolute luxury. They had stolen my safety net to buy her a life of pure, uninterrupted privilege. I had successfully proven the moral crime to myself. But as a forensic accountant, I knew that proving a moral failing was vastly different from proving a prosecutable legal crime in a court of law. When I tried to track the current location of the stolen money, I slammed into a massive, heavily fortified structural firewall. The original trust account established by my grandfather had been completely drained and officially closed 7 years ago. The paper trail showed that the stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled directly into a corporate shell entity named Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company. Because Preston Holdings was a private unlisted limited liability company, I could not simply pull up their current internal banking statements. Oregon corporate privacy laws strictly shielded their internal financial ledgers from any public view. I could see the empty shell of the company through the state business registry. I could see the original registration dates. I could clearly see my father, Richard Preston, listed as the primary registered agent. But the actual liquid money moving inside the company accounts was completely locked away in a legal black box. I needed a verified current paper trail showing active financial fraud. Without a signed court order from a judge, I could not compel their private bank to hand over the corporate ledgers. This created a highly dangerous legal paradox. If I filed a premature civil lawsuit based solely on 10-year-old bank statements, my father would immediately panic. He would instantly realize I had the original documents. He would immediately transfer any remaining funds out of the company, officially dissolve Preston Holdings, and hide the stolen money in untraceable offshore accounts or complex crypto wallets long before a judge could ever review my legal petition. I would tip my hand, and they would escape completely unharmed. I paced the hardwood floor of my apartment for 3 agonizing days, running headfirst into the exact same maddening legal roadblock. I was totally paralyzed. I needed a mistake. I needed an internal leak. I desperately needed my arrogant parents to make a careless, unforced error. The massive breakthrough finally came from a forgotten ghost of my childhood. I realized that people who are morally bankrupt enough to steal from their own children are almost always incredibly sloppy with their basic digital security. I thought back to the agonizing year before I was thrown out of the house. We had a shared family email address. It was a generic, easily forgotten account my mother had created exclusively to handle the family cell phone plan, the household utility bills, and generic junk mail. I had personally set up the account password recovery options when I was 12 years old because Susan was notoriously terrible with basic technology. On a desperate wild hunch, I opened a private secure browser on my laptop and typed in the old family email address. I tried the original generic password we had used a decade ago. It immediately failed. The screen flashed a red error message. I clicked the forgot password link. The system prompted me to type in the answer to the original security question. What is your favorite childhood street name? I typed in the name of the street where my grandfather used to live. The loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the screen refreshed. I was in. The inbox was an absolute chaotic disaster of promotional spam, expired coupons, and outdated community newsletters. I quickly used the search function, filtering the thousands of emails by the most recent dates and flagging anything containing the word Preston or financial. As the filtered results populated on my screen, my eyes locked instantly onto a message that had been sent just 2 days prior. It was an email forwarded directly from my father's personal business account to this old generic family address. It was almost certainly a careless accident, a simple autocomplete error in his email contact list, where he had typed the first few letters of my mother's name and hit send without double-checking the destination. The subject line read, "Urgent Final Invoice Preston Holdings, LLC." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. My mouth went completely dry as I moved my cursor over the message and clicked it open. Attached to the brief, panicked email from my father was a highly detailed multi-page PDF document. I opened the attachment, and the breath completely left my lungs. It was an official, heavily itemized billing invoice from the Grand Summit Country Club. The Grand Summit was the single most expensive, exclusive, and prestigious event venue in the entire Pacific Northwest. The event type at the top of the invoice was boldly listed as a premier wedding reception. The name bride was Brittany Preston. The name groom was Bradley Sterling. I sat back in my chair completely stunned. Bradley Sterling. I recognized the name immediately from my commercial real estate dealings. Bradley was the sole inheriting son of the Sterling family, a dynasty that controlled a massive, lucrative portfolio of commercial properties across the state. My parents had finally done it. They had successfully leveraged their fake country club status to secure the absolute ultimate prize for their golden child. Brittany was marrying into a legitimate billionaire family, but it was the incredibly detailed financial breakdown on the following pages of the invoice that made my blood run entirely cold. The itemized costs for the lavish wedding reception were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars allocated for imported, out-of-season floral arrangements. A massive budget for a 12-piece live orchestra. Outrageous catering costs featuring imported caviar and premium top-tier open bars. The final total cost of the single evening came to an absolutely breathtaking $150,000. My eyes darted frantically to the billing information section at the very bottom of the final page. The financial entity contractually obligated and legally responsible for paying this massive sum was not Richard Preston. It was not Susan Preston. The legally binding vendor contract was signed guaranteed and billed directly to Preston Holdings, LLC. They were using the exact same fraudulent shell company that currently held my stolen grandfather's trust fund to finance the high society wedding of the decade. My parents were literally planning to impress the wealthy, powerful Sterling family, using the very money they had ruthlessly robbed from their own teenage daughter. I scrolled down to the strict payment schedule outlined by the country club venue. A massive, non-refundable final balloon payment of $80,000 was contractually due exactly 72 hours before the wedding date. The date of the wedding was listed at the top of the invoice. The ceremony was rapidly approaching. It was scheduled to happen in exactly 3 weeks. Richard and Susan were completely draining the absolute last remaining drops of my stolen financial future in one desperate, arrogant gamble to buy Brittany a wealthy husband and secure their own permanent placement in high society. A cold, brilliant, entirely terrifying smile slowly spread across my face. In the absolute quiet of my Seattle apartment, the impenetrable legal firewall had just completely and spectacularly crumbled. I did not just have outdated bank statements anymore. I now possessed documented, undeniable, time-stamped proof that their fraudulent corporate entity was currently active. I had proof it was holding massive sums of liquid cash, and I had proof that those funds were intended for a specific, highly timed luxury transaction. They were no longer just hiding my stolen money in the dark. They were actively, proudly trying to spend it in the broad daylight. My parents had just handed me the exact devastating weapon I needed to absolutely destroy them. The timing of their grand societal debut could not have possibly been more perfect for an aggressive forensic accountant. I realized in that moment that I was not just going to quietly sue them for the stolen money. I was not going to let them settle out of court behind closed doors. I was going to let them build their beautiful, expensive stolen house of cards right up to the very top. I was going to let them invite every wealthy, important person they knew to witness their grand triumph. And then at the exact moment they thought they had won everything, I was going to pull the floor completely out from under them. The thick cream envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. My firm receptionist walked into my office and placed it directly on the center of my desk, with a raised eyebrow. It was heavy sealed with a ridiculous gold wax stamp, bearing the initial P for Preston, and addressed in sweeping, overly elaborate calligraphy. It was not a legal threat. It was a wedding invitation. I stared at the gold foil lettering that announced the upcoming marriage of Brittany Rose Preston to Bradley Thomas Sterling. The venue was the most exclusive country club in the entire Pacific Northwest. But what caught my immediate attention was the small folded piece of personal stationery tucked behind the formal RSVP card. I pulled it out and recognized my mother Susan's sharp, slanted handwriting immediately. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for reconciliation. It was a list of demands masquerading as a family obligation. Abigail, the note began, completely ignoring the fact that we had not spoken peacefully in 10 years. Bradley's parents are asking questions about my youngest daughter. They are traditional family-oriented people, and it looks incredibly suspicious that you have not been involved in any of the wedding planning. We need you to attend the pre-wedding dinner this weekend and play the part of the happy, supportive sister. Do not mention our past disagreements. Do not talk about your little job. We need to project absolute unity. Furthermore, since you have been absent, we expect you to cover the remaining costs for Brittany's bridal shower catering. The final bill is $6,000. Consider it your wedding gift to your only sister. See you on Saturday. I sat back in my leather office chair and read the arrogant, delusional note a second time. My mother actually believed she could summon me like a disobedient servant, order me to perform a fake family reunion for her wealthy future in-laws, and then casually demand I pay $6,000 for the privilege. 10 years ago, a demand like this would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and shame. I would have felt the crushing weight of their constant financial manipulation. But sitting in my corner office as a certified forensic accountant, looking at the exact same handwriting of the woman who had illegally drained my grandfather's trust fund, I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, brilliant sense of opportunity. They wanted me to play the part of the happy sister. They wanted me to enter their fake, glamorous world and witness their ultimate triumph. They had absolutely no idea that I already possessed the internal bank records of their fraudulent corporate shell company. They had no idea I knew they were completely broke. I needed inside access to understand the exact timeline of their financial house of cards. I needed to see exactly how desperate they truly were. So I picked up a pen, filled out the gold-foiled RSVP card, and decided to attend the pre-wedding dinner. I was going to gather every piece of intelligence I needed to tear them down. The pre-wedding dinner was held at an upscale, deeply intimidating steakhouse in downtown Portland. The private dining room was reserved entirely for the Preston and Sterling families. When I walked through the heavy mahogany doors on Saturday evening, wearing a simple tailored black suit that cost more than my parents' entire monthly mortgage payment, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of roasted garlic, expensive red wine, and desperate suburban posturing. My mother spotted me the exact second I entered the room. Her eyes widened slightly, taking in my polished appearance, but she recovered her fake composure instantly. She walked over, grabbed my upper arm with the exact same painful digging grip she had used when I was a teenager, and pulled me toward the back of the room. "You are late," Susan hissed under her breath. A smile plastered firmly on her face for the benefit of the surrounding guests. "And you are wearing black to a wedding celebration. You look like you are attending a funeral." "I am attending a family function," I replied evenly, keeping my voice completely perfectly level. I assumed black was appropriate. She narrowed her eyes completely, missing the sarcasm. "Just stay out of the way. Bradley's parents are seated at the head table. You are sitting at the back near the kitchen doors with the distant cousins. And hold my coat. I need to go greet the event coordinator. Do not cause a scene, Abigail." She shoved her heavy cashmere coat into my arms and walked away without waiting for a response. I folded the coat over a nearby chair and took my assigned seat at the very back of the room. I was positioned perfectly. The small, isolated table near the kitchen doors gave me an unobstructed view of the entire room. I could see the head table clearly. I could watch my parents work the room. I was treated like absolute garbage, seated as far away from the important guests as possible. But being invisible was exactly what I wanted. Invisible people hear everything. As the dinner service began, I watched my father Richard hold court at the main table. He was sitting directly across from Bradley's father, a silver-haired commanding man named Charles Sterling. The contrast between them was painful to watch. Charles Sterling possessed the quiet, relaxed confidence of a man who actually owned a commercial real estate empire. My father possessed the loud, sweaty desperation of a man who was pretending to be wealthy. I sipped my ice water and focused my attention completely on their conversation. Richard was speaking loudly, making sure his voice carried over the clinking silverware. "Our latest acquisitions have been incredibly lucrative." Charles, my father, boasted, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet. "Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company has been expanding our commercial footprint across the entire metropolitan area. We just secured a massive warehouse district property. The capital returns are beyond our initial projections. It takes a lot of liquid cash to play in this market, but you understand how that works." Charles Sterling nodded politely, offering a generic non-committal smile. "Indeed, Richard. Real estate requires substantial capital reserves. We are glad Brittany comes from a family that understands the value of building a lasting portfolio. I gripped my water glass so tightly my knuckles turned white. My father was looking a legitimate billionaire directly in the eye and lying with absolute breathtaking arrogance. He was boasting about Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company. He was bragging about massive capital returns and lucrative property acquisitions. I knew the exact truth. I had the printed bank statements locked in my Seattle apartment. Preston Holdings owned absolutely zero commercial real estate. Preston Holdings produced zero revenue. The only liquid cash in that entire fraudulent company was the stolen $200,000 my grandfather had left for my education. My father was using my stolen inheritance to artificially inflate his ego and secure a wealthy marriage for his favorite daughter. I watched Brittany lean her head on Bradley's shoulder, smiling a perfect practice smile. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. I mentally calculated the cost of the jewelry, the cost of the private dining room, and the cost of the vintage wine flowing freely at the head table. They were burning through my grandfather's money at a terrifying speed. They were running a full-scale confidence scam on the Sterling family, and I was the only person in the room who knew the entire foundation was completely hollow. As the waiters began clearing the main course plates, I saw Richard check his phone and suddenly go pale. He excused himself from the table with a tight, forced smile and walked quickly toward the back hallway near the restrooms. He looked agitated. He looked incredibly desperate. I waited exactly 30 seconds before standing up and following him. The back hallway of the restaurant was dimly lit and lined with heavy acoustic panels. I walked silently on the carpeted floor, stopping just short of the corner where the hallway branched toward the private management offices. I pressed myself flat against the wall and listened. My father was not alone. He was speaking in a frantic, hushed tone to a woman holding a large clipboard. I recognized her from the country club invoice I had intercepted. She was the senior event coordinator for the upcoming wedding, Mr. Preston. The woman said, her professional tone laced with severe irritation. We have been incredibly patient, but we simply cannot proceed with the final floral and catering orders until the account is completely settled. The final payment of $80,000 was due yesterday. You promised the wire transfer would clear this morning. I heard my father let out a shaky, anxious breath. There has been a minor administrative delay with our corporate bank, he said using his loudest, most authoritative businessman voice. It is a completely routine hold on a large capital transfer. Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company is moving massive funds from a recent property acquisition. The money is sitting in escrow right now. I just need you to authorize the vendors to proceed. The funds will absolutely be released the week of the wedding. You have my word. The event coordinator let out a heavy sigh. Your word does not pay our imported catering staff, Mr. Preston. If that $80,000 balloon payment does not hard clear our accounts exactly 72 hours before the ceremony, the entire reception is legally canceled. That is our absolute final deadline. We will not set up a single table until the bank confirms the transfer. I will have the corporate accounts release the funds manually. My father promised, his voice cracking slightly with suppressed panic. Just keep the wedding preparations moving forward. Do not mention this to the Sterling family. I am handling it completely. The coordinator's footsteps echoed as she walked away, leaving my father standing alone in the hallway. I heard him curse under his breath, a sharp, terrified sound. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed a number. Susan, he whispered harshly into the phone. The venue is threatening to pull the plug. They want the final $80,000 immediately. We have to authorize the final withdrawal from the holding account right now. Yes, I know it drains the last of it. I do not care. Once Brittany marries Bradley, we will have full access to the Sterling family credit lines. We just have to make it through the reception. Do the transfer tomorrow morning. I stopped breathing. The entire puzzle clicked together in my mind with devastating perfect clarity. The extravagant country club wedding was not just a celebration. It was a calculated, desperate financial investment. Richard and Susan were completely out of money. They had spent a decade slowly draining my $200,000 inheritance to maintain their fake upper-class lifestyle. Now they were standing at the absolute edge of bankruptcy. The lavish wedding was a massive, unfunded house of cards hanging entirely on a single final wire transfer from the stolen trust fund. They were betting their entire future on tricking the wealthy Sterling family into a marriage before the money ran out. They firmly believed that once Brittany was legally tied to Bradley, the wealthy in-laws would unknowingly cover their massive debts to avoid a public societal scandal. My parents were not just thieves. They were financial predators, and they were about to drain the very last penny of my grandfather's legacy to fund their final grand illusion. I walked back into the private dining room and sat down at my isolated table in the back. I watched my mother laughing loudly at a joke Charles Sterling had told. I watched my father return to the table, his face flushed and sweating desperately, pretending to be a successful commercial real estate mogul. I watched Brittany sip her champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that her perfect fairy tale wedding was being financed by stolen blood money. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully buried their unwanted daughter and used her stolen future to buy their way into the elite class. They were absolutely certain that the final $80,000 payment would clear the bank, the country club doors would open, and their grand deception would be perfectly complete. They had severely underestimated the girl they threw out into the rain. I did not cause a scene at the dinner. I did not throw my glass of water in my father's face. I simply stood up, retrieved my mother's heavy cashmere coat from the back of my chair, and walked it over to the head table. I placed it gently over the back of her seat. Susan did not even look at me. She just waved her hand dismissively, completely engrossed in her conversation with Bradley's mother. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped into the cool, damp Portland night. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the personal number of Jonathan Pierce, the most aggressive, ruthless estate litigation attorney in the entire state of Washington. I had consulted with him quietly the week before, waiting to gather exactly this kind of actionable intelligence. Jonathan answered on the second ring. They are initiating the final massive wire transfer from the fraudulent limited liability company this week. I told him, my voice completely stripped of any remaining hesitation. They are attempting to move $80,000 to a country club vendor. I heard the sharp scratch of a pen on the other end of the line. Do we have the original trust documents and the proof of unauthorized withdrawal? Jonathan asked, his tone instantly shifting into battle mode. I have everything, I replied. I want to file the emergency ex parte injunction immediately. I want to legally freeze Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company and every single bank account connected to my parents. We can file first thing Monday morning, Jonathan confirmed. A judge will grant an immediate asset freeze with this level of documented misappropriation. When is the targeted vendor payment scheduled to draft? Exactly 72 hours before the wedding, I said, staring at the glowing neon sign of the restaurant behind me. Jonathan let out a low, appreciative whistle. If we freeze the accounts now, the payment will trigger a catastrophic hard bounce. They will not be able to access a single dime of the stolen money. The entire event will collapse. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with a total financial freeze? I thought about the generic markdown grocery store cake my father had thrown into the garbage on my 18th birthday. I thought about the 4 grueling hours I spent sitting on the front porch with my life packed into garbage bags. I thought about the decade of exhausting, relentless work I had endured, while they used my grandfather's money to buy country club memberships and designer clothes. I am absolutely certain, I told my attorney. Freeze every single account. Let them try to pay for their fake life with an empty checkbook. I hung up the phone and walked to my rental car. The trap was perfectly set, the legal mechanism was activated, and my parents were about to experience the absolute unyielding terror of losing everything. I left the suffocating atmosphere of the Portland steakhouse and drove straight back to Seattle through the dead of night. The heavy rain lashed against my windshield, but my mind was completely clear. I had walked into that pre-wedding dinner as the discarded, invisible younger sister. I walked out as the architect of their impending financial ruin. When I finally pulled into the underground parking garage of my downtown office building, the digital clock on my dashboard read 4 a.m. on Sunday. I did not go home to my apartment. I went straight up to the 22nd floor. The forensic accounting firm was completely silent and pitch black, save for the emergency exit lights glowing at the end of the long corridors. I unlocked my office, turned on my desk lamp, and booted up my heavy dual monitors. I had a massive complex puzzle to solve, and I needed the absolute processing power of my professional investigative databases. I opened the fragile, yellowed bank statements from my stolen inheritance trust and laid them out neatly across my mahogany desk. Then I opened a blank, massive spreadsheet on my left monitor. It was time to follow the blood money. My father had proudly boasted to the wealthy Sterling family that Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company was a massive, lucrative commercial real estate empire. He claimed he was acquiring expensive warehouse districts and swimming in liquid capital. I logged directly into the secure state corporate registry and pulled the official legally filed documents for Preston Holdings. The reality was a pathetic, completely hollow joke. The company was nothing but a ghost ship. It owned absolutely zero commercial real estate properties in the state of Oregon. It had zero registered employees. It filed zero payroll taxes. The only tangible asset the company had ever officially recorded was the initial capital injection of $200,000, the exact amount stolen directly from my grandfather's protected trust fund. I started building a comprehensive timeline matching the exact dates of the trust fund withdrawals to my parents' historical lifestyle expenses. The numbers flowed into my spreadsheet, painting a vivid, disgusting picture of suburban greed. I factored in the exorbitant initiation fees for their exclusive country club. I added the estimated costs of my sister Brittany's luxury imported vehicle. I calculated the premium private university tuition they had happily paid for her, while telling me I was not worth the investment. I tabulated the cost of their lavish European vacations, their expensive home renovations, and their designer wardrobes. As I totaled the columns, a massive, glaring mathematical discrepancy leaped off the screen. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the final number. The math simply did not add up. $200,000 is a significant amount of money, but it is not infinite. Based on their reckless, arrogant spending habits, they should have burned through my entire stolen inheritance in exactly 5 years. But it had been a full decade since they drained the trust. They had somehow managed to maintain their incredibly expensive, fake upper-class lifestyle for another 5 full years, without a single legitimate source of significant income. My father had lost his job at the auto shop years ago. My mother was a part-time grocery store cashier. So how were they paying the massive monthly minimums on their credit cards? How were they keeping the country club membership active? Where was the massive bridge money coming from to delay the angry wedding vendors? I rubbed my tired eyes and leaned closer to the glowing monitors. I applied a rigorous forensic technique known as lifestyle auditing. I calculated their estimated monthly burn rate against their known legitimate income. There was a staggering, gaping hole in their finances. They were spending at least $10,000 a month that did not officially exist on paper. They had to be stealing from another secondary source. They were feeding a massive financial beast that required constant illegal cash injections just to keep the suburban illusion alive. I closed my eyes and thought about my parents. I stripped away their arrogant words and focused purely on their actions. Where did they have absolute, unquestioned access to large pools of money? Where did they hold positions of complete authority and blind trust? The answer hit me with the force of a physical blow. The church. My parents absolutely loved to portray themselves as incredibly pious, generous community leaders at their affluent suburban congregation. They practically lived at the church, volunteering for every single prominent leadership position. Susan was the head of the Community Outreach Committee. Richard was the primary treasurer for the Church Building Expansion Fund. They controlled the flow of charitable donations with absolute authority. My hands flew across the keyboard. I immediately accessed the public nonprofit tax returns for their church organization. Every registered charity is legally required by the federal government to file an annual Form 990, detailing their exact revenues and major expenditures. I pulled the filings for the past 5 years and began scrutinizing the operational expense ledgers line by specific line. It only took me 20 minutes to find the massive, glaring anomaly. Under the section for professional consulting fees, the church was paying outrageous monthly sums to a third-party management firm. The stated purpose was for architectural consulting and project management related to the new community center expansion. The payments were remarkably consistent. Exactly $12,000 was wired out of the church charity fund on the first day of every single month. I opened a new tab and ran the name of the management firm through the Oregon Secretary of State Public Business Database. The registered agent address was not a legitimate corporate office. It was a generic post office box located in a rundown strip mall on the outskirts of Portland. I dug deeper, pulling the original articles of incorporation for the management firm. The primary managing member was listed under a different name, but I recognized it instantly. It was my mother's maiden name. The sickening realization washed over me, turning my blood to absolute ice. They were not just stealing from me. They were actively, systematically embezzling from their entire church congregation. They were siphoning off the honest charity donations meant for a new community center and using that money to pay their personal mortgages, their country club tabs, and their minimum credit card payments. They had transformed the sacred trust of their community into a personal slush fund to maintain their fake social status. I connected the two massive frauds together, and the entire architecture of their desperation finally made perfect, terrifying sense. The stolen inheritance money, sitting inside Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company, was acting as their ultimate safety net. They had locked the last $80,000 of my grandfather's money into a high-yield time certificate of deposit to earn a few extra pennies of interest. This meant they physically could not touch that specific cash until the exact maturity date, which just happened to fall exactly 1 week before Brittany's extravagant wedding. To survive until that maturity date, they had aggressively escalated their church embezzlement. They were draining the charity fund dry just to keep up the appearance of immense wealth for Bradley Sterling's billionaire family. Once the $80,000 from my stolen inheritance finally unlocked, they planned to pay off the furious wedding venue and seamlessly marry Brittany into the Sterling dynasty. Once they were legally connected to the Sterling family fortune, Richard and Susan assumed they would have access to unlimited elite credit lines. They planned to use their new wealthy in-laws to quietly replace the stolen church funds before the annual congregation audit in December. It was a massive, desperate, incredibly arrogant Ponzi scheme built entirely on stolen money, abused trust, and my stolen future. I sat back in my chair and stared at the digital corkboard I had built on my monitor. The arrows connected every single crime, every stolen dollar, and every arrogant lie directly back to Richard and Susan Preston. They had built a beautiful, glittering castle out of absolutely nothing but theft and deception. This was no longer just a personal mission to get my inheritance back. This was no longer just about a canceled 18th birthday or a thrown-away grocery store cake. My parents were active, predatory criminals who were causing immense financial harm to innocent people in their community. They were using the church congregation as an endless ATM to fund their own vanity. If I did not stop them right now, they would successfully trick the Sterling family, hide the embezzlement, and continue their toxic cycle of financial abuse forever. I picked up my cell phone from the desk. It was 6:30 in the morning on Sunday. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Seattle skyline, casting a pale, cold light across my office. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed the personal number of Jonathan Pierce. He was an aggressive, brilliant estate litigation attorney I had vetted weeks ago. I knew he was an early riser who lived for complex, high-stakes financial warfare. Jonathan answered on the third ring, his voice crisp and alert. "Good morning, Abigail. Tell me you have something actionable." "I have everything," I told him, my voice carrying a lethal, unshakable calm. "I found the stolen trust money. It is parked in a corporate shell company, scheduled to disperse exactly 72 hours before my sister's wedding. But it is much worse than we thought, Jonathan. I just uncovered a massive ongoing embezzlement scheme. They are actively draining their church charity funds to float their lifestyle until my stolen money clears the bank." I heard Jonathan let out a sharp, appreciative breath over the line. "Are you absolutely sure the documentation is solid? Can we prove the connection between the shell company and the church fraud?" "I am a forensic accountant, Jonathan. The paper trail I just compiled is completely bulletproof. I have the state registry filings, the nonprofit tax returns, and the specific routing numbers. I can trace every single stolen dollar directly to their personal expenses. I want to execute a coordinated, lethal legal strike. I do not just want my money back. I want to dismantle their entire operation permanently." Jonathan's voice dropped an octave, shifting into pure predatory legal strategy. "If we proceed with this, Abigail, it is going to be incredibly destructive. We can file a dual action first thing tomorrow morning. I will file an emergency ex parte injunction to immediately freeze Preston Holdings and secure your stolen inheritance. Simultaneously, we will draft a formal, documented tip to the State Attorney General and the Fraud Division regarding the nonprofit embezzlement. We will hand them the entire prosecution on a silver platter. I looked at the photograph of my late grandfather sitting on the corner of my desk. He had worked his entire life to leave me a safety net to ensure I would have a fair chance at an education and a future. My parents had looked at that gift and seen nothing but a free vacation fund. They had looked at me and seen nothing but a disposable burden. They believed they were untouchable. They believed their fake wealth and their country club smiles made them immune to consequence. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the real cost of their actions. Do it. I told Jonathan, my tone completely devoid of any hesitation or mercy. File the injunction. Alert the state authorities. I want every single bank account associated with their names completely frozen by tomorrow afternoon. I want them to walk up to the counter to pay for that lavish wedding reception and find out their money is entirely gone. Consider it done, Jonathan replied, the fierce satisfaction evident in his voice. The legal filings will be on the judge's desk when the courthouse opens. Your parents are about to hit a solid brick wall at 100 miles an hour. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop. The exhausted, terrified teenager who had cried on the rainy streets of Portland was finally gone. In her place was a woman who knew exactly how to use the law to exact absolute, devastating justice. The trap was fully set. The legal machinery was roaring to life. My parents had built their perfect, arrogant lives entirely on stolen foundations, and I was about to trigger the massive, inescapable earthquake that would bring it all crashing down around them. Monday morning arrived with a cold, clear sky over Seattle, washing away the weekend rain. I walked into the sleek, modern downtown offices of Jonathan Pierce at exactly 8 o'clock. I did not bring a simple folder of grievances. I brought a meticulously organized, fully indexed banker's box containing the absolute destruction of my parents' financial lives. Jonathan was already waiting for me in his glass-walled conference room. He was a formidable man in his late 50s, a veteran litigator who specialized in dismantling fraudulent estates and punishing financial predators. I laid the documents out across his massive conference table. I showed him the original trust documents bearing my grandfather's signature. I showed him the decade-old bank statements detailing the unauthorized withdrawals that started the exact month after my 18th birthday. I presented the fraudulent tax returns where Richard and Susan had falsely claimed me as a disabled dependent, highlighting the direct malicious threat to my professional certified public accountant license. Finally, I handed him the intercepted email containing the massive invoice from the Grand Summit Country Club. Jonathan was completely quiet as he reviewed the timeline I had built. He traced the lines of stolen money from my grandfather's protective trust straight into the Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company. He reviewed the public tax filings demonstrating the active, undeniable embezzlement from their church's charity fund. Abigail, Jonathan said, his voice carrying a deep professional respect. In 30 years of estate litigation, I have rarely seen a forensic paper trail this perfectly constructed. You have handed me a fully loaded weapon. They left their fingerprints on every single stolen dollar. I sat across from him, my hands folded calmly on the polished glass table. I need to know exactly how fast we can lock them down, Jonathan. The country club is scheduled to auto-draft the final $80,000 balloon payment on Wednesday morning. That is exactly 72 hours before my sister's wedding ceremony. If that money leaves the corporate account, it will be incredibly difficult to claw it back from a third-party vendor. We have to sever their access before the bank opens on Wednesday. Jonathan did not hesitate. We are going to file an emergency ex parte injunction right now. An ex parte order means we are petitioning the court without giving any prior notice to your parents. Normally, the court requires both parties to be present. But in cases of severe documented financial fraud, where there is a massive and immediate flight risk for the remaining capital, a judge can legally freeze the assets instantly. If we warned Richard and Susan, they would drain the company accounts, transfer the cash to offshore accounts, and claim bankruptcy. We are not going to give them that chance. We spent the next 4 hours finalizing the legal petition. Every claim was backed by undeniable hard evidence. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we were standing inside the King County Courthouse. Because my legal residence and my professional license were anchored in Washington state, and the fraud crossed state lines impacting federal tax laws, the local judge had the full jurisdictional authority to initiate the freeze on their interconnected accounts. Waiting outside the judge's chambers was the longest hour of my entire life. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the quiet marble-lined hallway. I thought about the night I had been thrown out. I remembered the heavy black garbage bag sitting on the wet porch. I remembered my mother telling me I was no longer part of the family, simply because I wanted to attend a summer science program I had rightfully earned. They had tossed me away like literal garbage, fully intending to leave me uneducated, impoverished, and desperate. They had underestimated my resilience, and they had grossly underestimated my intelligence. The heavy oak doors finally opened, and Jonathan walked out into the hallway. He was not smiling because men like Jonathan Pierce do not smile when they are doing serious legal work, but his eyes were completely alight with predatory satisfaction. The judge granted the emergency injunction. Jonathan said, his voice low and intense. He took one look at your forensic accounting timeline and signed the order without a single second of hesitation. The court recognizes the clear and present danger of absolute asset depletion. Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company is now legally paralyzed. Furthermore, the judge ordered a comprehensive freeze on every single personal checking and savings account bearing the names Richard and Susan Preston. A profound, heavy sense of relief washed over me, followed instantly by a sharp, thrilling surge of adrenaline. What happens now? I asked. Now the court clerk transmits the emergency freeze order directly to their banking institutions in Oregon. Jonathan explained, matching my brisk pace as we walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sunlight. By the time the banks open for business tomorrow morning, your parents' financial existence will be completely locked down in a judicial vault. They cannot withdraw cash. They cannot transfer funds. They cannot use their debit cards. They cannot even write a check for a cup of coffee. Their entire fraudulent empire is officially frozen. The trap had been legally set. Now all I had to do was wait for the timer to count down to 0. Tuesday passed in a state of absolute agonizing anticipation. I went to my office and worked through my standard client files, projecting an aura of complete normalcy, while my heart hammered a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I knew what was happening behind the scenes. I knew that heavily encrypted legal directives were flying between state courthouses and banking executives. I knew that the automated financial systems my parents relied upon to fund their fake luxury lifestyle were silently updating, locking them out of their own stolen wealth. Then came Wednesday morning, the 72-hour mark. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the automated billing system at the Grand Summit Country Club initiated the final non-refundable invoice draft. The country club's accounting software reached out to the primary checking account for Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company, requesting the immediate transfer of $80,000 to cover the massive wedding reception. They needed the funds to pay for the imported caviar, the premium open bars, the extravagant multi-course dinner, and the elite serving staff. In the past, the fraudulent corporate account would have automatically approved the transfer, fueled by the money stolen from my grandfather's trust and the cash embezzled from the church charity fund. But today, the bank's automated system hit the judicial freeze. The transaction request collided directly with the emergency ex parte injunction. The response code was immediate, brutal, and completely unforgiving. Insufficient funds. Account frozen by court order. Transaction declined. But it was not just the massive country club venue that hit the brick wall. Brittany's entire luxury wedding was built on a foundation of delayed payments and empty promises. My father had actively stalled every single major vendor, promising them that the corporate funds would clear the week of the wedding. Because they were marrying into the wealthy, highly respected Sterling family, the vendors had foolishly trusted the Preston name. Now the bill was completely due, and the automated requests were triggering all across the city. At 9:15, the elite high-end floral designer attempted to charge the final $15,000 balance for the cascading sugar roses, the imported orchids, and the massive table centerpieces. The credit card terminal blinked red. Transaction declined. Account frozen. At 9:30, the exclusive 12-piece live orchestra scheduled to play during the grand evening reception ran the final $10,000 electronic check through their processing system. The bank immediately rejected the routing number. Transaction declined. At 10 o'clock, the luxury limousine service, booked to transport the bridal party from the sprawling suburban church to the elite country club, attempted to authorize a $5,000 deposit. The charge failed instantly. Within a single hour, Exactly 72 hours before my sister was supposed to walk down the aisle and solidify my parents' fake upper-class status, their entire financial universe completely detonated. I was sitting at my desk in Seattle, quietly reviewing a spreadsheet, when my personal cell phone lit up. It was a Portland area code. The caller ID was blocked, but I did not need to see a name to know exactly who was desperately trying to reach me. I watched the phone vibrate across the mahogany wood. I did not pick it up. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 minutes later, it rang again, and then a fourth time. The calls were coming in back to back in a relentless, panicked barrage. I logged into my secure voicemail portal and listened to the first message. It was my mother, Susan. Her voice was not dripping with fake sugary sweetness anymore. The manipulative maternal tone she had used just days ago was completely gone. She sounded absolutely frantic, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. "Abigail, pick up the phone right now!" Susan demanded, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "Something is wrong with the bank. Something is horribly wrong with our accounts. The country club just called your father and they are threatening to cancel Brittany's entire reception. Our debit cards are declining everywhere. Did you do something? Pick up the phone, Abigail. This is not a game. You need to call me back immediately." I deleted the message. 5 minutes later, a second voicemail arrived. This time it was my father, Richard. He was not using his authoritative, booming businessman voice. He sounded like a man who was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, watching the water rise past his knees. "Abigail, answer me!" Richard shouted into the phone, the background noise indicating he was pacing rapidly. "The bank is telling me there is a legal freeze on Preston Holdings. They mentioned a court order from Washington State. What the hell did you do? You have absolutely no idea what you are messing with. We have vendors calling the house. Brittany is in the other room having a panic attack. If you hacked into our accounts, you are going to federal prison. Fix this right now. Call the bank and fix this right now." I leaned back in my chair and took a slow, deep breath. The irony was incredibly delicious. He was threatening me with federal prison for exposing the exact financial crimes that were actually going to send him there. He still thought he could bully me into submission. He still fundamentally believed I was the weak, compliant teenager who would magically fix his messes and absorb the blame for his failures. He had not yet realized that I did not just lock the door to his stolen wealth. I had completely demolished the entire building. The panic in the Preston household must have been reaching an absolute boiling point. I pictured them running around their heavily mortgaged suburban home, frantically checking online banking portals, only to see aggressive red banners declaring their accounts were frozen pending legal investigation. I pictured Brittany completely oblivious to the real source of her parents' money, throwing a massive tantrum because the florist had just sent a blunt email refusing to deliver her imported orchids. They were trapped in a nightmare entirely of their own making. For 10 years, they had spent my money. For 10 years, they had stolen from the innocent members of their own church congregation. They had built an entire false reality based on arrogance, greed, and the absolute certainty that they would never be caught. The vendors were not just receiving standard decline notices. They were receiving notifications that the accounts were locked due to judicial orders. In the tight-knit, highly communicative world of elite event planning, news of a massive financial default travels faster than a wildfire. The Grand Summit Country Club would not quietly hide the unpaid bill. They would immediately start demanding answers from the Sterling family. The wealthy in-laws who had been promised a union of equals were about to discover that the Preston family was nothing but a hollow, bankrupt shell. The new conflict was completely out of my hands now. It belonged to the chaos of reality. The dominoes were falling, and I had positioned them so perfectly that nobody could stop the chain reaction. My parents were completely cornered. They had no access to cash, no access to credit, and an incredibly expensive, highly public wedding scheduled in less than 3 days. I knew exactly what they would try to do next. Desperate predators do not suddenly confess and apologize. They double down. They would try to find another victim, another source of funds to exploit, just to keep the illusion alive for 72 more hours. But I had already anticipated their next move. I was 3 steps ahead, and the trap was perfectly primed for the wedding day. I sat at my desk and watched my cell phone screen light up over and over again. The incoming calls from Portland were relentless. My parents were caught in the terrifying, suffocating grip of a total asset freeze, and they were reacting exactly the way desperate predators always do when they finally lose control of their prey. They were throwing everything at the wall, oscillating wildly between vicious threats and pathetic sobbing pleas, hoping something would break my resolve. I ignored the active calls, letting them all roll directly to my secure voicemail. When my phone finally went quiet for a brief moment, I opened the audio files and listened to the extinction burst of my completely cornered family. The first voicemail was from my mother, Susan. Her voice trembled with a heavily manufactured breathless panic. She was attempting to deploy the same weaponized guilt she had used to manipulate me throughout my entire childhood. "Abigail, please pick up the phone right now," Susan pleaded, forcing a loud theatrical sob into the receiver. "I do not understand why you are doing this to us. We are your family." Brittany has been crying in her room for 3 straight hours. Her entire wedding is going to be completely ruined if you do not call the bank and lift whatever malicious block you put on our accounts. You are breaking your sister's heart over some silly decades-old misunderstanding. I know you felt left out when you were younger, but destroying your only sister's special day is just incredibly cruel. Please, sweetheart, just call me back so we can fix this together like a real family. I sat back in my chair and let the recording play out. A silly decades-old misunderstanding. That was how my mother chose to describe throwing her 13-year-old daughter out into the street and systematically stealing $200,000 from a legally protected inheritance trust. She was entirely incapable of genuine remorse. She only cared that the money tap had been shut off right before her grand societal debut. The very next voicemail was from my father, Richard. He did not bother with fake tears or maternal pleas. His voice was a booming, venomous roar of absolute outrage. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat!" Richard shouted, the audio crackling with the sheer volume of his rage. "You have completely crossed the line. You have absolutely no right to interfere with my corporate accounts. I am calling my attorney. I am calling the local police. I am going to have you arrested for digital terrorism and corporate espionage. You are going to lift this illegal freeze immediately, or I swear to God I will drive up to Seattle and physically drag you out of your office. You have until noon to fix this, Abigail, or you are entirely dead to me." I listened to his furious threats with absolute icy calm. He was completely powerless, and we both knew it. The freeze was not a digital hack. It was a lawful, ironclad injunction signed by a superior court judge based on undeniable forensic evidence of grand larceny. Richard could not call the police, because the police would immediately ask to see his corporate ledgers. He could not call his attorney because his attorney would demand a retainer fee that Richard could no longer pay. He was a fraud backed into a corner screaming at a wall. I picked up my phone, selected both of their contact profiles, and permanently blocked their numbers. The absolute golden silence that filled my office felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I had spent my entire life bracing for their demands. Now I would never have to hear their voices again. But as a forensic accountant, I knew the battle was not entirely over. Shutting off their communication did not mean they had surrendered. Narcissists do not simply accept defeat and apologize when their primary funding source runs dry. They immediately pivot. They frantically search for a new victim, a new loophole, or a new scam to keep their illusion alive. Richard Preston desperately needed $80,000 in liquid cash to pay the Grand Summit Country Club within the next 48 hours, and I knew exactly where he would try to get it. I called Jonathan Pierce, my estate litigation attorney, to confirm my suspicions. "They are blocked from the corporate accounts, and their personal credit lines are frozen," I told Jonathan. But Richard is not going to cancel this wedding. He has too much arrogant pride invested in parading his golden daughter in front of the billionaire Sterling family. He is going to try to secure a predatory, hard money bridge loan to cover the country club invoice. Jonathan agreed instantly. Hard money lenders do not care about credit scores or frozen traditional assets. They care about immediate hard collateral. They offer fast, unregulated cash at incredibly toxic interest rates. If your father can prove he has authorized access to a high-value asset to put up as collateral, a predatory lender will wire him the $80,000 by the end of the business day. But what collateral does he have left? His house is heavily mortgaged. The business LLC is frozen. I stared at the financial timeline mapped out on my computer monitors. "He has the church," I said quietly. The realization was horrifying, but completely logical. Richard was the primary treasurer for his affluent church congregation's building expansion fund. He had authorized access to massive charitable accounts, holding hundreds of thousands of dollars in innocent community donations. I had already uncovered the paper trail proving he was skimming $12,000 a month from those exact accounts to float his country club lifestyle. Now that his back was against the wall, I knew with absolute certainty that he would brazenly use the entire church charity fund as guaranteed collateral to secure a high-interest loan from a shadow lender. He would risk the financial destruction of hundreds of trusting families just to ensure his daughter had an open bar and imported orchids on Saturday night. I could not let innocent people lose their hard-earned money to fund my family's vanity project. I had to permanently sever his access to the church funds before he could execute the loan documents. I opened a highly secure encrypted email server on my laptop. I drafted a meticulously detailed, completely anonymous message directed to the senior board of directors at the suburban Portland church. I did not use vague accusations or emotional language. I used the clinical, devastating precision of a formal forensic audit. To the board of directors, I wrote, "It is my civic and professional duty to inform you of an ongoing systematic financial embezzlement regarding your community building expansion fund. The primary treasurer, Richard Preston, has been actively misappropriating charitable donations to a private holding company." I attached the specific verified routing numbers. I attached the public registry filings proving that the third-party management firm, receiving $12,000 a month, was actually a shell company registered under Susan Preston's maiden name. I highlighted the exact dates and times the money had been illegally moved. Finally, I warned them that the treasurer was currently attempting to leverage the entire remaining balance of the charity fund as unauthorized collateral for a private predatory loan. I strongly advised them to initiate an immediate internal audit and temporarily revoke all financial access privileges for Richard Preston to prevent catastrophic financial loss. I hit send. The digital dossier flew silently through cyberspace, landing directly in the inboxes of the 5 most powerful members of the church congregation. I spent the rest of Thursday aggressively monitoring the digital fallout. By late Thursday afternoon, the ripples of my anonymous tip had turned into a massive tidal wave. While I could not see the internal church communications, I could track the public status of the corporate filings. The predatory lender Richard had been pursuing suddenly canceled the pending credit inquiry. The shadow loan had completely fallen through. The church board had clearly acted on my evidence. They had executed their fiduciary duty, triggered an emergency financial review, and locked my father completely out of the charitable accounts before he could steal another dime. The trap was now hermetically sealed. Every single avenue of escape had been blocked. The stolen trust fund was frozen by a judge. The personal credit cards were maxed out and declining. The predatory loan was dead. The church piggy bank was locked and under active investigation. My parents had absolutely zero access to capital, and the clock was rapidly ticking down to the final hour. Friday morning arrived. It was the eve of the grand wedding. In less than 24 hours, Brittany was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry Bradley Sterling. I sat in my Seattle office sipping a hot cup of black coffee, waiting for the inevitable news that the wedding had been canceled. I fully expected to see a tearful, victimized public announcement on Susan's social media page, blaming a sudden family emergency or an unforeseen venue disaster for the sudden postponement. I expected them to tuck their tails, hide from the humiliation, and try to figure out how to avoid federal prison. But noon passed. Then 3 in the afternoon passed. Then 5 o'clock arrived. I checked Brittany's public social media accounts. There was no cancellation announcement. Instead, she had just posted a glowing, heavily filtered photograph of herself holding a glass of champagne at a luxury downtown salon. The caption read, "Getting my bridal manicure done. I cannot wait to marry the man of my dreams tomorrow. Best weekend of my life." I stared at the screen, utterly baffled. The venue had not been paid. The florist had not been paid. The caterers were legally within their rights to refuse service. My parents were completely unequivocally broke. How on earth were they planning to host a $150,000 reception at the most exclusive country club in the state tomorrow evening? I called Jonathan Pierce. They did not cancel the wedding. I told my attorney, scrolling through a dozen more of Britney's oblivious celebratory posts. They are pushing forward. The rehearsal dinner is literally happening right now. Are they completely delusional? Jonathan let out a harsh, knowing laugh over the phone. They are not delusional, Abigail. They are executing the most desperate, brazen scam in the financial playbook. It is called floating a bad check. He explained the mechanics of their final terrifying gamble. Richard and Susan knew the corporate LLC accounts were frozen, but they still possessed the physical printed paper checks associated with those accounts. The Grand Summit Country Club had demanded an $80,000 final payment 72 hours prior to the event. When the automated wire transfer failed on Wednesday, Richard likely called the venue director and blamed a simple banking error. To secure the venue for Saturday, he would have promised to hand-deliver a physical cashier's check directly to the country club management first thing Saturday morning, right before the reception started. But he is not going to hand them a certified cashier's check. Jonathan continued, his voice cold with professional disgust. He is going to hand them a standard fraudulent paper check drawn on the frozen LLC account. Because tomorrow is Saturday, the banking system operates on a delayed processing schedule. The country club will deposit the physical check, but the banks will not officially communicate the hard bounce until Monday morning. The absolute sheer arrogance of their plan left me completely speechless. They were going to hand a worthless piece of paper to the venue director. They were going to smile, shake hands, and force the country club to open the grand ballroom doors. They planned to eat the imported caviar dance to the live orchestra and watch their daughter officially marry a billionaire heir. They are betting their entire existence on the marriage certificate, I realized out loud, gripping the edge of my desk. Exactly, Jonathan confirmed. Once the marriage license is signed on Saturday afternoon, Britney legally becomes a sterling. When the massive $80,000 check inevitably bounces on Monday morning, the furious country club will immediately threaten to go to the press and expose the fraud. Richard and Susan are banking on the absolute certainty that the wealthy, prestigious Sterling family will quietly write a real check to cover the massive debt, just to avoid a humiliating public societal scandal for their newlywed son. They are using Bradley's family as a human shield. They are staging a hostile financial takeover of the Sterling dynasty. It was a brilliant, incredibly toxic strategy. It relied entirely on the social pressure of high society. The Sterlings would pay the ransom to protect their family name, and my parents would walk away completely scot-free, successfully tethered to a billionaire fortune. They would never have to answer for the stolen inheritance. They would never have to answer for the church embezzlement. They would simply reset their parasitic lives in a brand new, vastly wealthier host family. We cannot let them get away with this, I told Jonathan, a fresh wave of protective fury rising in my chest. If they trick that family, they win. They validate every single terrible thing they have ever done. We are not going to let them win, Jonathan replied smoothly. The legal freeze was just the first phase, Abigail. You have the absolute right to serve the formal court injunction paperwork regarding your stolen trust funds to the registered agents of the LLC. You have the right to do that anywhere at any time in front of any witnesses you choose. I looked out my office window at the darkening Seattle sky. The rain had started to fall again, streaking the glass. I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had walked into the rain a decade ago, convinced she was worthless. I was not that girl anymore. I was a professional, and I was going to finish the audit. I am driving down to Portland tonight, I told my attorney. I want you to meet me there tomorrow. We are going to attend a wedding reception. The heavy Seattle rain had followed us all the way down the interstate to Portland. I sat in the passenger seat of my rental car, watching the windshield wipers rhythmically clear the water away as we pulled into the massive, sprawling parking lot of the Grand Summit Country Club. Jonathan Pierce sat quietly next to me, reviewing a thick manila folder of legal subpoenas and bank records. We had skipped the actual church ceremony entirely. I had absolutely no desire to sit in a wooden pew and watch my sister pledge her life to a billionaire heir, while wearing a designer gown paid for with my stolen future. We were here strictly for the reception. We were here for the collapse. I stepped out of the car and smoothed down my tailored navy suit. The country club was a towering monument to old money and exclusive prestige. Massive white columns framed the grand entrance, and a fleet of valet drivers in crisp uniforms hurried to open doors for the arriving guests. 300 of the most elite, wealthy individuals in the Pacific Northwest were currently flowing through the polished mahogany doors, completely expecting a night of imported caviar vintage champagne and endless luxury. They were shaking off their expensive umbrellas, laughing loudly, and handing beautifully wrapped gifts to the front desk attendants. Jonathan and I bypassed the main greeting line and walked quietly up the sweeping marble staircase to the second-floor mezzanine. The elevated balcony provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire grand lobby and the massive closed double doors leading into the primary ballroom. We stood entirely out of sight, two silent ghosts waiting for the financial earthquake to strike. Down below, the atmosphere was electric with high society anticipation. The guests mingled in the lavishly decorated foyer, holding their intricately calligraphed seating cards. I spotted Bradley Sterling, the groom, standing near the center of the room. He looked effortlessly wealthy in his custom tuxedo, smiling and shaking hands with a group of older men who looked like corporate executives. His father, Charles Sterling, stood nearby, projecting an aura of absolute financial authority. My parents had desperately wanted to merge their fake hollow lives with the Sterling dynasty. They were just minutes away from finalizing their ultimate scam. But as my eyes drifted toward the heavy gold-accented doors of the grand ballroom, I saw the exact moment the gears of my trap finally snapped shut. The senior venue director, a tall, impeccably dressed man holding a leather clipboard, marched firmly out of the ballroom. He was flanked by two large, broad-shouldered men wearing discreet earpieces and dark security suits. The director did not look like a man preparing to welcome a happy bridal party. His face was rigid, his jaw set in a tight line of absolute professional fury. He positioned himself directly dead center in front of the closed ballroom doors, crossing his arms and signaling to the security guards to stand entirely in front of the brass handles. A few moments later, my father strode into the lobby. Richard Preston looked like a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. He was wearing a stark white tuxedo jacket, a fresh boutonniere pinned to his lapel, and a smug, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He walked right past the mingling guests, ignoring the Sterling family, and headed straight for the ballroom doors to orchestrate the grand entrance. I leaned forward against the cold marble railing of the mezzanine, my heart hammering a rapid, thrilling rhythm against my ribs. Richard approached the venue director and waved his hand dismissively, gesturing for the man to open the doors. Even over the loud, echoing chatter of 300 guests, the acoustics of the grand lobby carried their voices perfectly up to the balcony. "Go ahead and open them up," my father commanded using his booming, arrogant businessman voice. "The bridal party is arriving in the limousines in 5 minutes. We need the waitstaff lined up with the champagne trays immediately." The venue director did not move a single inch. He looked my father directly in the eye, his expression completely devoid of any customer service warmth. "We will not be opening the doors." "Mr. Preston," the director said, his voice ringing with absolute icy authority, "and there will be no champagne service tonight." My father stopped dead in his tracks. His arrogant smile faltered, replaced by a flash of deep, sudden confusion. "What on earth are you talking about? I gave you the physical cashier's check personally on Thursday morning, just like we discussed. The $80,000 was guaranteed. Open the damn doors before the Sterling family comes over here." The director stepped marginally closer to my father, refusing to be intimidated by the aggressive posturing. "You gave me a standard corporate paper check drawn on Preston Holdings, Mr. Preston. We deposited it immediately. Our banking institution contacted us exactly 1 hour ago to inform us that the check has suffered a catastrophic hard bounce. Your corporate accounts are not just empty. They are entirely locked under a severe judicial freeze. The transaction was completely rejected." I watched from the balcony as the blood drained completely and absolutely out of my father's face. His skin turned a sickly ashen gray. He took a physical step backward, staring at the venue director, as if the man had just spoken to him in an alien language. Richard had fully banked on the financial system taking at least 48 hours to process the fraudulent paper check. He had bet his entire life on the weekend processing delay. He had absolutely no idea that Jonathan Pierce and I had filed an emergency ex parte injunction that flagged the specific transaction the exact second it touched the banking network. "Listen to me," Richard stammered, his booming voice suddenly cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "There has to be a simple banking error. It is a massive misunderstanding. The funds are there. I have the capital. You have to let us inside. My daughter is marrying Bradley Sterling. Do you have any idea who his family is? If you ruin this reception, I will sue this country club into absolute oblivion." The director simply shook his head, completely unmoved by the frantic threats. "You cannot sue anyone with a frozen bankrupt corporate account, Mr. Preston. Our legal contract was incredibly explicit. If the final $80,000 balloon payment did not successfully clear our accounts, the entire event is null and void. You deliberately handed me a worthless piece of paper to try and trick us into hosting a $150,000 reception. We do not provide charity to fraudsters. The reception is permanently canceled." The sheer volume of my father's ensuing outburst shattered the polite, sophisticated hum of the lobby. He completely lost his mind. He lunged forward aggressively, pointing his finger directly into the venue director's face. "You open those doors right now!" Richard screamed, the sound echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings. "I am Richard Preston. I am paying for this event. You work for me. Get out of my way before I have my security remove you." The entire lobby went absolutely dead silent. 300 wealthy elite guests stopped talking, stopped drinking, and turned simultaneously to stare at the horrifying spectacle unfolding by the ballroom. The music from the string quartet playing in the corner slowly, awkwardly ground to a halt. Charles Sterling, standing just a few yards away, lowered his glass of scotch, his sharp, calculating eyes locking onto my father with intense, sudden suspicion. Before the security guards could physically intervene and push my father back, the heavy glass doors at the front entrance of the lobby swung open. Brittany marched inside, surrounded by her bridesmaids. She looked like a pristine porcelain doll wrapped in $15,000 worth of custom white silk and imported lace. She was grinning wildly, ready to be worshipped by the massive crowd of affluent guests. But as she stepped into the center of the silent room, she immediately sensed the incredibly toxic, heavy atmosphere. She looked at the guests staring at her in total shock. Then she looked at our father, who was currently sweating profusely and screaming at the venue management. Brittany pushed her way through the crowd, dragging her massive train across the marble floor. "Dad, what is going on?" she demanded, her high-pitched voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Why are the doors closed? The orchestra is supposed to be playing our entrance song." The venue director turned his attention to my sister, offering her a look of deep, genuine pity. "I am very sorry, Ms. Preston. Your father failed to pay the remaining $80,000 balance for the venue and the catering. His corporate check bounced entirely. We have formally canceled the reception." I watched my sister process the words. I watched the perfectly constructed, deeply arrogant reality she had lived in her entire life completely fracture into a million irreparable pieces. Brittany let out a sound that I could only describe as a primal, ear-piercing shriek. It was not the delicate, sad cry of a disappointed bride. It was the absolute, unhinged meltdown of a spoiled, entitled golden child who had just been told the word no for the very first time in her 20-year-old life. She turned on our father, her face contorting into an ugly, furious mask. "You did not pay them!" She screamed the words, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent watching crowd. "You told me everything was handled. You promised me this would be perfect. Bradley's entire family is standing right there." Richard tried to grab her hand, stammering desperately. "Brittany, sweetheart, calm down. It is just a bank error. It is a stupid administrative mistake. I am going to fix it right now. Just smile and go stand with Bradley. Do not tell me to calm down." Brittany shoved him away violently, completely losing any remaining shred of social grace or dignity. "You ruined my wedding. You lied to me. You are embarrassing me in front of everyone." She reached up and grabbed her expensive custom-tailored veil, ripping it violently out of her carefully styled hair and throwing it directly onto the lobby floor. She stomped her foot like a furious toddler, screaming unintelligible insults at my father, demanding he produce the money instantly. It was the most spectacular, deeply humiliating public tantrum I had ever witnessed. Bradley Sterling looked completely horrified. He stood frozen in the crowd, staring at his new wife as she screamed and wept on the floor of the country club. His father, Charles, did not look horrified. Charles looked incredibly angry. As Brittany continued to sob hysterically, the guests were treated to an even more devastating visual. Through the decorative glass panes of the closed ballroom doors, movement became visible. The country club catering staff, dressed in their formal black uniforms, were rapidly rolling the massive silver serving carts full of expensive food directly back into the commercial kitchens. The towering multi-tiered wedding cake was pushed away into the shadows. A few seconds later, the side doors of the ballroom opened, and the members of the exclusive 12-piece live orchestra began walking out. They were carrying their cellos and brass instruments, completely packing up their gear and walking straight past the stunned guests toward the rear exit. The venue was actively, systematically dismantling the entire reception right in front of the Sterling family's eyes. It was absolute, undeniable proof that the Preston family was entirely broke. Charles Sterling finally stepped out of the crowd. He walked directly up to my father, completely ignoring the screaming bride on the floor. Charles did not yell. He spoke with the quiet, lethal authority of a billionaire who had just realized he was being scammed. Richard Charles said, his voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence. "You looked me in the eye an hour ago and boasted about your massive commercial real estate portfolio. You told me your corporate accounts were overflowing with liquid capital. And now the venue is rolling the food away because your check bounced. I want an explanation, and I want it right now. Are you bankrupt?" My father was visibly shaking. The sweat was pouring down his forehead, soaking the collar of his white tuxedo shirt. He looked around the lobby, searching desperately for any possible escape route, any possible lie that could save him from the absolute destruction of his reputation. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable reality of his own massive fraud. That was when my mother, Susan, stepped into the center of the ring. Susan Preston possessed a survival instinct built entirely on shifting the blame to anyone else. She had spent my entire childhood making me the scapegoat for every single family failure, and she was not about to stop now. She saw her wealthy future slipping away. She saw her husband crumbling under Charles Sterling's furious gaze, and she executed the most desperate, theatrical lie of her entire life. She rushed forward, placing her hand dramatically on her chest, completely ignoring her weeping daughter on the floor. "Charles, please, you have to understand," Susan cried out, projecting her voice so every single wealthy guest in the room could hear her tragic tale. "We are not broke. We are the victims of a terrible, malicious cybercrime." Charles narrowed his eyes, clearly highly skeptical. "A cybercrime? Yes." Susan forced a few convincing, desperate tears to fall down her cheeks. "We have an estranged, deeply troubled older daughter named Abigail. She is an accountant in Seattle. She has been insanely jealous of Brittany her entire life. Abigail is a bitter, spiteful girl, and she hates us because we cut her off years ago. She works in finance, Charles. She hacked into our corporate banking network. She illegally froze our business accounts and stole our money just to maliciously ruin her sister's wedding day out of pure hateful spite. We have millions in the bank, I swear to you. Abigail just locked us out to publicly humiliate us." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of 300 guests. It was a spectacular, breathtakingly vicious lie. She was entirely willing to falsely accuse me of a federal cybercrime in front of 300 affluent witnesses just to save her own miserable social status. She was perfectly happy to paint me as an insane, jealous hacker to protect her fraudulent empire. Standing on the dark, quiet mezzanine balcony directly above them, I looked at Jonathan Pierce. My attorney simply raised his eyebrows, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. "She actually blamed you," Jonathan whispered, shaking his head in absolute disbelief at the sheer audacity of my mother's lie. I reached down and picked up the heavy leather briefcase sitting at my feet. It was completely packed with the original trust documents, the proof of the church charity embezzlement, and the official judge-signed injunctions. I rode in the passenger seat of the rental car as Jonathan Pierce drove us through the dark, rain-slick streets of the wealthy Portland suburbs. The glowing dashboard clock read 8:15 in the evening. The grand reception was supposed to be in full swing by now. Instead, the entire event was completely imploding. Following closely behind our vehicle was an unmarked dark gray sedan carrying 2 senior detectives from the Portland Financial Crimes Division. We had spent the entire morning and early afternoon in conference rooms with the local authorities. The incredibly detailed, completely anonymous digital dossier I had sent to the church board of directors had triggered an immediate massive panic. The board members had gone straight to the police, bringing my forensic paper trail with them. The authorities had quickly secured a formal emergency subpoena for Richard Preston's financial records regarding the church charity fraud. They had enough probable cause to pull him in for immediate questioning. I was not just arriving to ruin a party. I was arriving to deliver the absolute undeniable consequences of a decade of theft and manipulation. We pulled up to the sprawling, brightly lit entrance of the Grand Summit Country Club. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the night air sharp and biting. The fleet of valet drivers standing near the entrance took one look at the two detectives stepping out of the unmarked sedan with their badges visible on their belts, and they immediately stepped back, creating a wide, silent path for us. I smoothed down my tailored navy blue suit. I took a deep, steadying breath. I felt absolutely no fear, no anxiety, and no hesitation. For 10 years, I had been the invisible, discarded daughter. Tonight, I was the architect of their total destruction. Jonathan Pierce walked on my right side, carrying his heavy leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. The two detectives walked on my left. I reached out and pushed open the massive glass double doors of the country club. The scene inside the grand lobby was absolute chaotic bedlam. It was a spectacular portrait of high society panic. 300 wealthy elite guests in custom tuxedos and designer evening gowns were crowded together, whispering frantically and staring at the center of the room. The string quartet had completely vanished. The catering carts had been rolled away. At the center of the disaster stood my family. My sister Brittany was sitting directly on the cold marble floor in her incredibly expensive custom white silk gown, weeping uncontrollably, her mascara running down her face in thick black rivers. My father Richard was sweating profusely, his face an unhealthy shade of ashen gray as he desperately tried to explain himself to the venue manager. And then there was my mother. Susan Preston was standing near the closed ballroom doors, waving her arms and putting on the theatrical performance of a lifetime. She was sobbing loudly, projecting her voice so every single affluent guest could hear her tragic, entirely fabricated tale. She was actively telling the billionaire Sterling family that they were the victims of a malicious cybercrime perpetrated by a jealous, estranged daughter. I did not run into the room. I did not yell to get their attention. I walked at a perfectly measured, slow and deliberate pace directly toward the center of the lobby. The hard, sharp click of my heels against the polished marble floor echoed through the large space, cutting cleanly through the frantic murmurs of the crowd. One by one, the wealthy guests noticed me. They noticed the confident, sharply dressed attorney walking beside me. More importantly, they noticed the two grim-faced police detectives flanking us. The whispers rippled outward like a wave, growing louder for a brief second before dying out completely. The entire country club lobby went absolutely incredibly silent. The only sound left in the massive room was my mother taking a sharp, panicked intake of breath. Susan turned around and saw me. For a fraction of a second, her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. She recognized the absolute end of her empire. But her toxic, deeply ingrained survival instinct took over instantly. She decided to double down on her massive lie in front of 300 witnesses. She raised a trembling finger and pointed it directly at my face. "There she is!" Susan screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "That is Abigail! That is the crazy, spiteful girl who hacked our bank accounts. Arrest her right now. She stole our money. She ruined her sister's wedding out of pure, hateful jealousy. Do your jobs and arrest her." The two financial crimes detectives did not move to arrest me. They stood perfectly still, their eyes locked intently on my father. I did not even look at my mother. I completely ignored her desperate screaming. To me, she was nothing more than background noise. I walked right past her pointing finger, right past my weeping sister on the floor, and stopped directly in front of Charles and Bradley Sterling. Charles Sterling, the patriarch of the billionaire real estate dynasty, looked at me with cold, highly calculating eyes. He took in my professional suit, my completely relaxed posture, and the legal counsel standing at my shoulder. He knew immediately that I was not a crazy, jealous hacker. Bradley stood slightly behind his father, looking completely shell-shocked and horrified by the entire situation. "Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm, even and clinical. "My name is Abigail Preston. I am a certified forensic accountant working in Seattle. I am also the daughter that Richard and Susan Preston threw out of their home into the rain exactly 10 years ago. I turned to Jonathan Pierce. He opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, firmly bound file folder. He handed it to me. I held the file out, offering it directly to Charles Sterling. The wealthy billionaire took it slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "My mother is lying to you," I stated clearly, projecting my voice so the entire Sterling family and every single country club guest standing nearby could hear every single word. There was no malicious cyber attack. There was no unfortunate banking error. The Preston family corporate accounts are entirely empty tonight because they were legally frozen by a superior court judge yesterday morning. Inside that file, you will find the certified legal injunctions bearing the judge's signature. Charles Sterling opened the heavy folder. His eyes began to scan the highlighted legal documents and the incredibly detailed financial spreadsheets I had created. I did not stop speaking. I wanted the truth completely exposed in the bright light of the lobby. My parents do not own a lucrative commercial real estate empire. I continued, my voice steady and completely relentless. Preston Holdings Limited Liability Company is a completely fraudulent shell company. It owns absolutely zero property. It generates absolutely zero revenue. For the past 10 years, Richard and Susan Preston have been living exclusively off $200,000 they illegally stole from a protected inheritance trust that my grandfather established for my education. They use my stolen money to buy their country club memberships, their luxury cars, and the designer clothes on my sister's back. They are completely undeniably broke. I watched Bradley Sterling physically recoil. He stepped closer to his father, looking over his shoulder at the undeniable bank statements proving that my family had zero legitimate wealth. I turned my attention directly to the groom. When they completely ran out of my stolen money last month, they became absolutely desperate. I told Bradley, ensuring he understood exactly how he had been used. They realized they needed to pay for this incredibly expensive, lavish wedding to convince your wealthy family that they were financial equals. So my father started embezzling directly from his church charity expansion fund. A massive collective gasp erupted from the crowd of guests. Several of my parents' affluent church friends were standing in the audience dressed in their finest formal wear. I heard a woman near the front cry out in pure shock, covering her mouth with her hands. My father was siphoning $12,000 a month from the church collection plates to pay his personal credit card minimums, I announced to the horrified room. He planned to hand this country club venue a completely worthless, fraudulent check today, force the reception to happen, marry Brittany into your family, and then use the Sterling family fortune to cover his massive debts and avoid going to federal prison. They were going to use you as a human ATM. Charles Sterling snapped the thick folder shut. The sharp sound echoed through the silent lobby like a gunshot. He looked up from the documents and turned his gaze to Richard Preston. The billionaire did not yell. He did not lose his temper or cause a scene. He simply looked at my father with the absolute profound disgust, usually reserved for something foul scraped off the bottom of a shoe. "You parasitic, pathetic fraud," Charles said quietly, his voice dripping with pure venom. Richard tried to speak. He held up his shaking hands, his face drenched in sweat. "Charles, please listen to me." Richard stammered, his voice a weak, trembling whine. "She is lying to you. She fabricated all of those papers. It is a complete setup. I am a successful businessman." Jonathan Pierce stepped forward, completely destroying my father's final lie. "I am a senior estate litigation attorney," Mr. Preston Jonathan said loudly, ensuring the entire room heard him. "Those are official certified court records. If you claim they are fabricated, you are committing perjury in front of 300 witnesses and 2 active police detectives." Bradley Sterling turned away from my father and looked down at Brittany. My sister was still sitting on the cold marble floor, clutching the voluminous skirt of her ruined custom gown. She looked up at the man she was supposed to marry with wide, terrified, tear-filled eyes. "Bradley, baby, please," Brittany sobbed, reaching a shaking hand up toward him. "I did not know anything about this. I swear to you, I did not know we were broke. I love you. We can still get married." Bradley looked at her, and the final illusion completely shattered. He saw the entire pathetic, greedy charade for exactly what it was. He did not look at her with love. He looked at her with absolute, crushing contempt. "You did not know," Bradley repeated, his voice harsh and unforgiving. You have never worked a single day in your entire life. You let your parents steal money from a church charity fund, so you could have imported orchids and a 12-piece live orchestra at your wedding. You are just as fraudulent as they are. Bradley took a large step backward, physically distancing himself from my family. He did not offer his hand to help Brittany off the floor. He looked at his father, his face set in a hard, resolute mask. "We are leaving right now," Bradley announced to the room. "The wedding is completely canceled." He did not look back at the crying bride on the floor. He turned around and walked straight toward the front glass doors of the country club. Charles Sterling dropped my forensic file onto a nearby cocktail table. He looked at Richard one last time. "Do not ever attempt to contact my family again," Charles warned him, "or I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life in a courtroom." Charles signaled to his wife and the rest of his affluent relatives. Like a perfectly coordinated military unit, the entire Sterling family turned their backs on the Prestons and walked out of the country club. The sound of the heavy glass doors closing behind them was the final devastating nail in the coffin of my parents' societal ambitions. The rich, powerful family they had tried to exploit had completely rejected them. The glittering illusion was dead. Now it was time for the harsh legal reality. The two Portland financial crimes detectives stepped forward, crossing the lobby toward my parents. The taller officer approached my father, who was still staring blankly at the doors where the Sterling family had exited. "Richard Preston," the detective said, pulling a folded legal document from the inside pocket of his jacket. "We have a court-ordered subpoena for all of your personal and corporate financial records. Furthermore, we need you to step outside with us right now. You are being officially detained for questioning regarding the active misappropriation of charitable funds from your community church." Richard completely collapsed. His knees simply gave out, and he hit the marble floor of the country club with a heavy thud. The arrogant, booming suburban king who had threatened to have me arrested for digital terrorism just yesterday was now weeping openly like a terrified, helpless child. "I can fix it." Richard kept repeating his voice, a pathetic, broken whimper as he knelt on the floor. "I can put the money back. I just need a little bit of time. Please do not do this. Let me call my bank." The detectives did not hesitate. They reached down, gripped my father by his arms, and hauled him forcefully back to his feet. They did not put him in steel handcuffs in the middle of the lobby, but their grip was absolutely unyielding. They marched him firmly toward the front exit. Richard looked back over his shoulder at my mother, his eyes pleading for help, but Susan was entirely useless. Susan realized in that exact moment that everything was completely over. The wealthy billionaire son-in-law was gone forever. The fake commercial real estate empire was exposed as a joke. The wealthy country club friends standing in the lobby were staring at her with pure, unadulterated hatred, because they finally knew she had stolen from their sacred church fund. There was no one left to manipulate. There was no one left to blame. Susan fell to her knees right next to Brittany. She threw her head back and let out a loud, wailing, agonizing scream that echoed tragically off the crystal chandeliers above us. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was the desperate, terrifying sound of a narcissist realizing that her carefully constructed mirror had been permanently, violently shattered into a million pieces. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth on the marble floor, completely ruined in front of the exact high society crowd she had sacrificed her own daughter to impress. I stood perfectly still in the center of the beautiful, chaotic lobby. I looked at the ruined designer wedding dress pooling on the floor. I looked at the abandoned floral arrangements sitting on the tables. I looked at the weeping, destroyed women kneeling on the cold stone. I felt absolutely no pity, and I felt absolutely no guilt. I walked slowly over to my mother. I stood directly above her, looking down at the woman who had made my teenage years a living nightmare. She stopped rocking and looked up at me. Her face was streaked with running black makeup. Her eyes were filled with toxic venom and absolute crushing despair. "You ruined us." Susan choked out her voice, a harsh, hateful whisper. "You ruined your own family. You destroyed your sister's life." I looked down at her with complete, unshakable peace. The terrified little girl she had thrown away 10 years ago was entirely gone. "No, Susan." I said, my voice cold and incredibly clear, ensuring she heard every single syllable. "You completely ruined yourselves. But you should have let me have my grocery store birthday cake. It would have been a lot cheaper than this. I did not wait for her response. I turned around and walked away. I did not look back at my crying sister holding her torn veil. I did not look back at my mother sobbing uncontrollably on the floor of the country club. I walked straight toward the heavy glass doors, pushing them open, and stepping out into the cool, fresh air of the Portland night. Jonathan Pierce walked beside me, a deeply satisfied professional smile on his face. As we walked down the front steps, 3 uniformed Portland police officers rushed past us, entering the country club to secure the scene and assist the detectives with the ongoing fraud investigation. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the rain-slicked pavement of the parking lot, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the end of the Preston family facade. I walked to the passenger seat of my rental car, opened the door, and got inside. I was a forensic accountant. I had thoroughly audited my family. I had systematically found the missing numbers, and tonight the books were finally perfectly balanced. She always blames me, I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of fear. Let us go downstairs and show Mr. Sterling what a real audit looks like.